You try to control fear, but it only grows. Buddhist monks have known for more than 2,500 years that resisting panic is feeding it. When you stop fighting and simply observe the sensation in your chest, the short breath, the racing heart, something shifts. Fear loses power. These 20 methods teach exactly that, transforming terror into presence. You are not broken. Your anxiety wants to show you where you lost connection with yourself. This ancient wisdom works in modern bodies because it touches the root, not the symptoms. Prepare to sleep while listening to this video. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment from which part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed how a moment of fear can completely hijack your mind? 1 second you're fine, and the next your heart is racing, palms sweating, and your thoughts are spiraling out of control. This experience is universal, but what's fascinating is that ancient Buddhist wisdom offers practical tools to work with these terrifying moments. Mindfulness meditation, known as sati in Pali, stands as perhaps the most fundamental practice for transforming our relationship with fear. Mindfulness meditation is essentially the practice of paying attention to our present moment experience with openness, curiosity, and without judgment. It sounds simple, but this basic approach represents a radical shift in how we typically relate to fear. Most of us instinctively try to push away, suppress, or escape our fears. Mindfulness takes the opposite approach by inviting us to turn toward our fear with awareness and gentleness. When we practice mindfulness regularly, we develop the capacity to observe our thoughts and emotions without immediately being consumed by them. This creates a crucial space between stimulus and response. For instance, when a fear-inducing thought arises like, "I might fail this important presentation," mindfulness allows us to see it simply as a thought, not an absolute reality. We learn to notice, there's a fear thought, rather than immediately believing, "I am definitely going to fail and it will be catastrophic." The Buddha taught mindfulness over 2,500 years ago as a direct path to liberation from suffering. He recognized that our tendency to resist unpleasant experiences and cling to pleasant ones creates a cycle of distress. By training in mindfulness, we learn to be with whatever arises with more balance and equanimity. The practice itself is straightforward but profound. You might begin by focusing attention on your breath, noticing the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. When your mind inevitably wanders, perhaps to fearful thoughts or worries, you simply notice that wandering and gently bring attention back to the breath. This basic training builds the mental muscle of awareness and the ability to redirect attention. What's particularly interesting is how mindfulness affects the brain. Neuroscience research shows that regular mindfulness practice actually reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, while increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and decision-making. Essentially, mindfulness helps regulate the brain's fear response, preventing it from overwhelming the thinking brain during stressful situations. For someone dealing with panic attacks or anxiety, mindfulness offers a concrete approach. When panic begins, mindfulness training helps you recognize the early warning signs, perhaps tension in your shoulders, rapid breathing, or racing thoughts. Rather than fighting these sensations, which often makes them worse, mindfulness teaches you to observe them with curiosity. How does this fear feel in my body right now? Where are the sensations strongest? Are they changing or staying the same? This observational stance helps deactivate the secondary fear response, the fear of the fear itself, which often amplifies panic. By allowing the initial fear sensations to be present without adding the extra layer of resistance, you create the conditions for the fear to naturally dissipate. Fear, like all emotions, is impermanent when not fed by our resistance or identification. Establishing a daily mindfulness practice creates a foundation that serves you when fear arises unexpectedly. Many people find that just 10 to 20 minutes of practice each day significantly improves their ability to stay present during challenging moments. You're essentially training your mind to remain stable and clear even when difficult emotions surface. The Buddha offered specific instructions for working with fear in meditation. In the Bhaya Sutta, he advised practitioners to stay exactly where they are when fear arises during meditation, rather than changing position or leaving. By maintaining awareness of the fear without reacting, its true nature is revealed as simply another passing mental state, not something that defines or controls us. Mindfulness also helps us recognize that fear often stems from thoughts about the future, not what's happening in the present moment. When we're firmly anchored in present moment awareness, we see that right now, in this moment, we're actually safe. The catastrophes we fear exist only in our thoughts about what might happen, not in our direct experience. For those new to mindfulness, guided meditations can be particularly helpful. These provide structure and gentle reminders to return to the present when your mind wanders into fearful thinking. Many free resources exist online and through apps that offer specific mindfulness practices for working with fear and anxiety. The beauty of mindfulness lies in its simplicity and accessibility. You don't need any special equipment or circumstances to practice, just your attention. This makes it an invaluable tool you can use anywhere, before a stressful meeting, during a turbulent flight, or in the middle of a difficult conversation. As your practice deepens, you may notice that fear loses its overwhelming quality. It becomes just another experience passing through your awareness, like clouds moving across the sky. This doesn't mean you'll never feel afraid. Fear serves important protective functions, but rather that fear no longer controls or defines your life. Mindfulness also reveals something profound about the nature of our minds. We are not our thoughts or emotions. We are the awareness that can observe thoughts and emotions arising and passing. This understanding creates tremendous freedom, as we're no longer completely identified with our fearful thoughts. In Buddhist psychology, this recognition is the beginning of wisdom. We start to see that many of our fears are based on misperceptions, conditioned reactions, or stories we've told ourselves rather than direct experience of reality. This clarity naturally leads to greater peace and equanimity, even in challenging circumstances. The path of mindfulness is one of patience and consistency. Results don't usually come overnight, but with regular practice, most people notice significant shifts in their relationship with fear. The practice becomes a refuge, a way of meeting life's inevitable challenges with greater balance, wisdom, and compassion. Loving kindness, meditation, metta, for dissolving fear. Imagine having access to an inner resource that could transform the energy of fear into the strength of love. That's exactly what the Buddhist practice of loving kindness meditation, or metta in Pali, offers. While mindfulness teaches us to be with fear, loving kindness actively cultivates its opposite, a mind state of warmth, goodwill, and genuine care that naturally dissolves fear's constricting grip. Fear and love represent two fundamentally different ways of relating to ourselves and the world. Fear contracts, separates, and creates boundaries, while love expands, connects, and transcends boundaries. This makes loving kindness meditation a direct antidote to the isolation and tension that fear generates in our bodies and minds. The practice itself is remarkably simple yet profound in its effects. It involves systematically directing wishes of well-being toward ourselves and others through silent phrases such as, "May I be safe," "May I be peaceful," "May I be healthy," and "May I live with ease." After establishing these intentions toward ourselves, we gradually extend the same wishes to others, loved ones, neutral people, difficult people, and eventually all beings everywhere. The Buddha taught metta as one of the 4 divine abodes or sublime states of mind. He particularly recommended this practice for those troubled by fear. In one famous story, he advised a group of monks who were terrified of forest spirits to practice loving kindness rather than fleeing the forest. The monks followed this advice and found that their fears subsided as their hearts filled with goodwill. What makes loving kindness so effective against fear? Several mechanisms are at work. First, it's nearly impossible to experience fear and love simultaneously. They represent opposing neurological and psychological states. By intentionally cultivating loving kindness, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms the body's stress response and counteracts the fight or flight reaction of fear. Second, many fears stem from a sense of separation or isolation, the feeling of being vulnerable and alone against potential threats. Loving kindness directly addresses this by fostering a sense of connection and care, both for ourselves and others. This sense of connection provides emotional security that makes fears less overwhelming. Third, the practice trains us to relate to ourselves with kindness rather than judgment. Many of us have internalized harsh inner critics that fuel anxiety and insecurity. Phrases like, "May I be kind to myself" and "May I accept myself just as I am" directly counteract this self-criticism that often underlies chronic anxiety. Research confirms the effectiveness of loving-kindness meditation for reducing fear and anxiety. Studies have shown that even brief periods of metta practice can increase positive emotions, reduce negative emotions, and decrease the body's stress response. Regular practitioners show increased activity in brain regions associated with empathy and emotional regulation, and decreased activity in fear centers. One particularly helpful approach is to direct loving-kindness specifically toward your fear itself. When anxiety or panic arises, you might silently offer phrases like, "May I be kind to this fear," "May I hold this fear with compassion," or "May this fearful part of me be at ease." This creates a radically different relationship with fear, one of friendly care rather than aversion or struggle. Many people find it challenging to begin with self-directed loving kindness, especially if they struggle with self-criticism or shame. If this is the case, you might start by bringing to mind someone who naturally evokes feelings of love and goodwill, perhaps a child, a pet, or a benefactor, and begin directing loving wishes toward them. Once the feeling of loving kindness is established, you can gradually include yourself in that circle of care. The practice works best when it's not mechanical or rote. Rather than simply repeating phrases, try to actually feel the intentions behind the words. Imagine what it would be like to be truly safe, peaceful, and at ease. Let these feelings permeate your body and mind. The emotional quality of the practice is what gives it power to transform fear. Interestingly, loving kindness doesn't just help with obvious fears, it also addresses the subtle background anxiety many of us carry without even realizing it. This constant low-level tension comes from an underlying sense that things aren't quite right or that we're somehow not enough. The regular practice of metta gradually dissolves these deeper insecurities by affirming our intrinsic worthiness of love and care. For those dealing with specific phobias or anxiety disorders, loving kindness works well in conjunction with other approaches. It creates an emotional foundation of security from which you can more effectively work with exposure therapy or cognitive restructuring. The self-compassion developed through metta helps make the process of facing fears more gentle and sustainable. Traditional Buddhist practice often combines loving kindness with the other divine abodes: compassion, care for those who are suffering; appreciative joy, delight in others' happiness; and equanimity, even-minded openness to all experiences. Together, these qualities create a heart that can remain open and steady even in challenging circumstances. The effects of loving-kindness meditation tend to build over time. Many practitioners report that, after weeks or months of regular practice, They notice a general shift in their baseline emotional state, more openness, warmth, and resilience in the face of difficulties. Fear doesn't disappear completely, but it no longer dominates their emotional landscape. What makes metta particularly valuable is that it addresses fear at its root, our fundamental sense of separation and vulnerability, by fostering genuine goodwill and connection. It transforms not just our emotional responses, but our entire orientation toward life. We move from a defensive posture of protection against threats to an open stance of engagement with life's inherent goodness. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but with consistent practice, loving kindness gradually becomes more natural and accessible, even in moments of stress or fear. The capacity for love and kindness is innate in all of us. The practice simply removes the obstacles that prevent this natural warmth from flowing freely. In this way, metta doesn't give us something new, but rather reveals what was already there, our inherent capacity for fearlessness through love. While loving kindness meditation offers us a way to transform fear through cultivating its opposite, another powerful Buddhist approach works directly with the nature of fear itself. Understanding impermanence, or anicca in Pali, provides profound insights that can fundamentally change our relationship with panic and anxiety. This principle isn't just philosophical theory, it's a practical tool that helps us relate to frightening experiences with greater ease and wisdom. Impermanence refers to the fact that everything in our experience is constantly changing, arising and passing away. Nothing stays the same for even 2 consecutive moments. Our thoughts, emotions, sensations, relationships, possessions, identities, all are in constant flux. While this might initially sound like bad news, after all, we often fear change. Deeply understanding impermanence can actually be incredibly liberating, especially when dealing with states of fear and panic. Think about the last time you experienced intense fear or a panic attack. In that moment, it likely felt overwhelming, as if the fear would last forever. This sense of permanence is precisely what makes fear so terrifying. When we're caught in panic, we lose perspective and forget that this state, like all states, will eventually change. We get trapped in what feels like an eternal present of fear. The Buddha pointed to this tendency of the mind and offered a revolutionary insight. By directly observing the changing nature of all phenomena, including fear itself, we can find freedom from their grip. Rather than seeing fear as a solid, permanent entity, I am afraid, we can recognize it as a temporary process of sensations, thoughts, and emotions flowing through our experience. This might sound abstract, but it translates into very concrete practices. When fear or panic arises, instead of getting caught in the story of fear or trying to make it go away, we can bring mindful awareness to the actual experience of fear as it manifests moment by moment. We might notice the physical sensations, perhaps tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, or a racing heart. We observe how these sensations aren't static but constantly changing in intensity, quality, and location. We also notice the thoughts that accompany fear, catastrophic predictions, self-criticism, or urgent demands for escape. With practice, we can see how these thoughts arise and pass away, how one thought leads to another in a chain, but none of them last. Even intense fear states oscillate. They get stronger, then weaker, then stronger again. They transform from moment to moment. By staying present with this changing flow of experience without resistance, something remarkable happens. We begin to develop a different relationship with fear. Rather than being completely identified with it or desperately trying to escape it, we learn to hold it in awareness with more spaciousness and less reactivity. We see firsthand that fear, like all emotional states, is impermanent. No matter how intense it feels, it will not last forever. This understanding cuts through one of the main mechanisms that amplifies panic, the fear of fear itself. When we've had panic attacks in the past, we often develop a secondary layer of fear. What if I panic again? What if I can't handle it? What if it never ends? By directly experiencing the impermanent nature of fear episodes, we gradually develop confidence that even intense fear states are temporary phenomena that will pass. This insight alone can prevent the escalation from initial fear to full-blown panic. There are specific practices that help us internalize this understanding of impermanence as it relates to fear. One approach is to mindfully label the changing aspects of experience during anxious states. Rising, falling, tightening, releasing, warming, cooling. This detailed attention to the fluctuating nature of experience helps counter the mind's tendency to solidify fear into something permanent. Another practice involves consciously recollecting past experiences of fear that have come and gone. By remembering previous times when you felt overwhelmed by fear and then recovered, you remind yourself of the transient nature of even the most intense emotional states. This builds confidence in your capacity to weather emotional storms. Scientists have actually documented what Buddhist practitioners have known for centuries. Emotions typically last for about 90 seconds unless we feed them with our thoughts. By observing fear with mindful awareness rather than proliferating fearful thinking, we allow the natural arising and passing of emotional waves without amplifying them. This understanding of impermanence doesn't just apply to fear itself, but also to what we fear. Many of our fears revolve around losing what we have or not getting what we want. When we deeply comprehend that everything is impermanent anyway, we can hold our experiences with a lighter touch. We still care deeply about life, but without the desperate clinging that generates so much anxiety. For example, if you're experiencing fear about a relationship ending, contemplating impermanence helps you recognize that all relationships change form over time, regardless of what we do. This doesn't mean giving up on the relationship, but it does mean you can engage with the situation from a place of wisdom rather than panic-driven reactivity. Similarly, if you're anxious about your health, understanding impermanence reminds you that bodies naturally change throughout life. This perspective doesn't eliminate appropriate care for your health, but it does reduce the anxious clinging to a particular state of health that can cause so much suffering. Even our identities, the sense of who we are subject to impermanence. Many fears revolve around threats to our self-concept. What if I fail and everyone sees I'm a fraud? Or what if this situation reveals I'm not as competent as I think I am? Seeing the changing, flowing nature of identity itself creates more space around these identity-based fears. The beauty of working with impermanence is that it's always available as a direct experience, not just a concept. In any moment of fear, we can turn our attention to the changing nature of our experience. This doesn't require special conditions or elaborate techniques, just a willingness to stay present with what's happening and notice its flowing, impermanent nature over time. This practice gradually transforms our relationship with fear from one of entrapment to one of wise engagement. We still feel fear. It's a natural human emotion with important protective functions, but we're no longer completely identified with it or controlled by it. We develop what Buddhists call fear without fearfulness, the capacity to experience the emotion of fear while maintaining inner stability and clarity. Understanding impermanence doesn't just help us in moments of panic. It subtly reshapes our entire approach to life. We learn to appreciate the preciousness of experiences precisely because they won't last forever. We develop more capacity to be fully present with both pleasant and unpleasant experiences, knowing that neither will persist indefinitely. This balanced engagement with life's changing nature brings a deep sense of peace that transcends our habitual patterns of fearful reactivity. This profound understanding of impermanence naturally leads us to another cornerstone of Buddhist psychology, the Four Noble Truths. While impermanence helps us work directly with the experience of fear, The Four Noble Truths provide a comprehensive framework for understanding why we feel fear in the first place and how we can find lasting freedom from it. The Four Noble Truths represent the Buddha's central insight into the nature of human suffering and the path to its cessation. Though they address suffering in general, they offer particularly valuable insights for understanding and working with fear. They provide both a diagnosis of why we experience chronic fear and anxiety and a practical roadmap for transforming our relationship with these challenging emotions. The first noble truth acknowledges that suffering, including fear and anxiety, is an inherent part of human experience. Rather than seeing fear as something abnormal or as a personal failing, this truth invites us to recognize fear as a universal aspect of being human. Everyone experiences fear. It's not just you. And it's not because you're doing something wrong. This acknowledgement itself can be tremendously relieving, especially for those who struggle with anxiety disorders. So much of our suffering comes not just from fear itself, but from our resistance to it, our belief that we shouldn't be afraid, or that our fear means something is fundamentally wrong with us. The first noble truth cuts through this secondary layer of suffering by normalizing the experience of fear. The Buddha was remarkably specific in describing different types of suffering, and many of his descriptions clearly include what we now call anxiety and panic. He spoke of the suffering of being separated from what we love, being united with what we don't love, not getting what we want, and the basic insecurity that comes from the changing nature of life. All these forms of suffering have fear as a component. The second noble truth goes deeper, identifying the cause of suffering as craving or clinging. This provides crucial insight into why we experience persistent fear. At its root, much of our fear stems from attachment to comfort, security, control, certainty, approval, or specific outcomes. The more tightly we cling to these desires, the more vulnerable we are to fear when they're threatened. For instance, if we're deeply attached to others seeing us as successful, we'll naturally experience intense fear around potential failure or judgment. If we cling to a sense of absolute safety and certainty, we'll be constantly anxious in a world that can't provide these absolutes. If we're attached to controlling our internal states, we'll panic when strong emotions arise that feel out of our control. The second noble truth helps us recognize these patterns of attachment that underlie our fears. It points us toward examining what we're holding onto so tightly that the mere thought of losing it triggers anxiety. This isn't about blaming ourselves for having attachments, they're natural human tendencies, but about seeing clearly how they contribute to our suffering. What's particularly valuable about this understanding is that it shifts our focus from the external triggers of fear to our internal relationship with experience. Rather than trying to control all the circumstances that might provoke fear, an impossible task, we can work with our own patterns of clinging that make us so vulnerable to fear in the first place. The third noble truth offers hope by declaring that freedom from suffering is possible, applied to fear. This means that while fear may be a natural human emotion, we don't have to be imprisoned by chronic anxiety or panic. By addressing the underlying causes of fear, particularly our patterns of attachment and aversion, we can experience a profound shift in our relationship with fearful states. This isn't about becoming someone who never experiences fear. Rather, it's about developing the capacity to experience fear without being dominated by it, to feel the emotion while maintaining inner freedom and clarity. The third noble truth assures us that this liberation is accessible to all of us, not just to spiritual masters or those with special abilities. The fourth noble truth outlines the practical path to this freedom through the noble eightfold path. This provides a comprehensive approach to working with fear that addresses every dimension of human experience, our understanding, intentions, speech, actions, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. The wisdom aspects of the path help us examine the beliefs and misperceptions that fuel our fears. For example, right view encourages us to investigate whether our anxious thoughts are actually true. Is it really the case that the worst will definitely happen? Is it accurate that we wouldn't be able to cope if it did? Right intention orients us toward meeting fear with kindness rather than aversion. The ethical dimensions of the path create conditions of safety and integrity that naturally reduce anxiety. When we live with right speech, right action, and right livelihood, we eliminate many sources of shame, guilt, and conflict that often trigger fear. There's a profound security that comes from living in alignment with our values. The meditation factors of the path, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, develop our capacity to work skillfully with fear when it arises. These practices help us stay present with fearful sensations without being overwhelmed, redirect our attention from unhelpful rumination to present moment reality, and cultivate inner stability that can withstand the turbulence of fear. What makes the Eightfold Path such a powerful framework for working with fear is its comprehensiveness. It doesn't just offer techniques for managing fear in the moment. It addresses the entire context of our lives that either supports fear or supports freedom from fear. It recognizes that how we think, communicate, act, work, and direct our attention all contribute to either our entrapment in fear or our liberation from it. This holistic approach stands in contrast to more narrowly focused methods that might only address the physical symptoms of anxiety or only work with changing fearful thoughts. The Buddha recognized that real transformation requires addressing all dimensions of our experience: physical, emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual. Applying the Four Noble Truths to fear doesn't mean we'll never feel afraid again. Fear serves important protective functions, and eliminating it completely wouldn't be wise even if it were possible. What changes is our relationship with fear, rather than being controlled by fear, fighting against it, or defining ourselves by it. We learn to hold fear in a larger context of understanding and compassionate awareness. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but as we continue practicing with these principles, we gradually discover greater freedom in relation to fear. We experience firsthand that while fear may arise due to causes and conditions, we don't have to be defined or limited by it, in the space between the stimulus of a fear trigger and our response to it. We find the freedom to choose how we engage with the experience of fear. The Four Noble Truths provide us with a comprehensive framework for understanding fear, and within this framework, right understanding, samadhi, serves as the crucial foundation for all Buddhist practice. As the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, right understanding offers specific insights that can directly dispel the illusions that feed our fears and anxieties. Right understanding isn't about adopting new beliefs or complicated philosophical concepts. Instead, it's about seeing reality more clearly, without the distortions that typically cloud our perception and generate fear. It's about recognizing how our minds create and amplify fear through misperception, and how clearer seeing naturally leads to greater peace. At its core, right understanding involves recognizing three fundamental characteristics of existence that the Buddha emphasized: impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. We've already explored impermanence and how understanding the changing nature of experience helps us work with fear. Now let's look at how the other aspects of right understanding can transform our relationship with fear. The Buddha observed that much of our fear stems from misunderstanding the nature of reality. We expect permanence from an impermanent world, satisfaction from experiences that cannot provide lasting satisfaction, and we mistake changing processes for solid, separate entities. These misperceptions set us up for continuous anxiety as reality inevitably fails to conform to our expectations. Take, for example, the common fear of aging or illness from the perspective of right understanding. These fears stem largely from not fully accepting the nature of having a body. bodies naturally age, get sick, and eventually die. This isn't a personal failure or something going wrong, but the natural unfolding of biological processes. When we deeply understand and accept this reality, our relationship with these inevitable changes shifts. We still take care of ourselves, but without the extra suffering that comes from fighting against natural processes. Or consider social anxiety, which often revolves around fears of judgment and rejection. Right understanding helps us see how we've constructed a solid sense of self that we believe others are judging. In reality, what we call self is a fluid, changing process dependent on countless conditions, not a solid entity that can be definitively judged or rejected. This insight doesn't make social interaction perfect, but it loosens the grip of paralyzing self-consciousness that fuels social anxiety. Health anxiety provides another clear example. Many people experience intense fear about potential illnesses, constantly checking their bodies for symptoms and imagining worst-case scenarios. Right understanding helps us see how the mind creates these frightening stories about the future, mistaking its projections for reality. We learn to distinguish between useful concern for our health and the mind's tendency to catastrophize beyond the evidence. One of the most practical aspects of right understanding for working with fear is recognizing the difference between reality and our interpretations of reality. Most of our fears don't stem directly from what's happening, but from the meanings and stories we attach to events. Someone doesn't return our text message, and our mind spins a story. They're angry with me, or they don't care about me anymore. The not returned message is fact. The interpretation is our addition, and often where fear takes root. By developing right understanding, we become more skilled at distinguishing between facts and interpretations. We catch ourselves in the act of adding fearful meanings to neutral events. This doesn't mean we never interpret, that's impossible, but we hold our interpretations more lightly, recognizing them as provisional rather than definitive. This creates tremendous freedom from anxiety-producing thought patterns. The Buddha recommended several practices for developing right understanding. Regular study of the teachings, Dharma, helps familiarize us with these clearer perspectives on reality. Contemplation allows us to deeply consider these teachings and apply them to our own experience. And meditation gives us direct insight into how our minds create suffering through misperception. It's worth noting that right understanding isn't just an intellectual exercise. While conceptual clarity is helpful, the Buddha emphasized experiential understanding, seeing directly for ourselves how these principles operate in our moment-to-moment experience. This is where meditation becomes essential, allowing us to observe in real time how the mind generates and sustains fear through misperception. For instance, during meditation, we might notice how a physical sensation, perhaps a pain in the chest, triggers a cascade of fearful thoughts about heart problems. We observe how quickly the mind jumps from sensation to interpretation to full-blown anxiety scenario. Just seeing this process clearly, without getting caught in it, begins to disrupt the automatic pattern of fear creation. In daily life, we can practice right understanding whenever fear arises by asking simple questions. What am I adding to this situation? What am I assuming that I don't actually know? What story am I telling myself? These questions help separate what's actually happening from what our minds are projecting onto the situation. Over time, this practice of questioning our fearful perceptions becomes more natural and automatic. We develop what the Buddha called yoniso manasikara, appropriate attention or wise reflection. Rather than automatically believing every fearful thought, we learn to examine our experience more carefully, distinguishing between helpful and unhelpful ways of relating to reality. An important aspect of right understanding is recognizing that our fears often reflect conditioned patterns rather than accurate assessments of reality. Many of our fears were formed early in life based on limited understanding or specific traumatic experiences. By seeing these patterns clearly, we can begin to update our understanding based on our adult perspective and current reality rather than past conditioning. This process isn't about positive thinking or forcing ourselves to see things in an unrealistically optimistic way. The Buddha emphasized seeing things as they actually are, neither better nor worse. Sometimes clear seeing reveals that our fears are exaggerated. Other times it confirms legitimate concerns. The freedom comes not from always finding everything to be safe and positive, but from relating to reality as it is without the additional suffering of distortion and misperception. Right understanding serves as the foundation for all other aspects of Buddhist practice because without it, our efforts may be misdirected. When we see clearly what causes fear and suffering, our approach to transformation becomes more effective and efficient. Rather than fighting against symptoms, we address root causes. Rather than struggling with reality as it is, we work with our relationship to that reality. The beauty of right understanding is that it's always available to us, in any situation. Even in moments of intense fear, we can pause and question our perceptions, opening to the possibility that things might be different than how our frightened mind is presenting them. This doesn't mean our fears magically disappear, but it creates space around them, preventing them from completely dominating our experience. As powerful as right understanding is for transforming our relationship with fear, it works most effectively when paired with practical techniques that help us regulate our nervous system during moments of fear and panic. This brings us to another essential Buddhist practice, mindful breathing, or anapanasati, which serves as a direct, immediate tool for calming the physical symptoms of fear. Conscious breathing is perhaps the most accessible and versatile method for working with fear in the moment. The breath serves as a bridge between mind and body, and by intentionally changing our breathing patterns, we can directly influence our nervous system, shifting from the sympathetic fight-or-flight response associated with fear to the parasympathetic rest and digest state of greater calm. The Buddha placed such importance on mindfulness of breathing that he devoted an entire discourse, the Anapanasati Sutta, to this practice. He described it as a method that, when developed and practiced regularly, brings great fruit and great benefit. For those dealing with fear and panic, the benefits of breath awareness become immediately apparent through its calming effect on the mind and body. What makes breath awareness particularly valuable for working with fear is its immediate accessibility. Your breath is always with you, requiring no special equipment or circumstances to practice. Whether you're in the middle of a job interview, stuck in traffic, facing a difficult conversation, or waking up with anxiety at 3 a.m, the breath is available as an anchor and resource. The basic practice is simple, bringing conscious attention to the natural flow of breathing. You might notice the sensation of the breath entering and leaving the nostrils, the rising and falling of the chest, or the expansion and contraction of the abdomen. The key is not to control or manipulate the breath initially, but simply to observe it with gentle, curious attention. When fear arises, our breathing typically becomes shallow, rapid, and high in the chest, a pattern that actually reinforces the body's stress response. By bringing awareness to this pattern, we can begin to shift toward deeper, slower breathing that signals safety to the nervous system. Even a few conscious breaths can begin to reduce the intensity of fear and create space for clearer thinking. There are several specific breathing techniques from the Buddhist tradition that are particularly effective for calming fear. One approach is to gradually extend the length of the exhalation relative to the inhalation. While a typical stress breathing pattern might involve quick inhalations and short exhalations, consciously extending the exhalation activates the parasympathetic nervous system, inducing greater calm. You might begin by simply counting your breaths, perhaps counting to 4 on the inhalation and to 6 on the exhalation. This gentle extension of the out-breath has a naturally calming effect without requiring forced or strained breathing. With practice, you might gradually increase the counts, but always maintaining comfort and ease. Another helpful technique is to incorporate a brief pause after the exhalation, before beginning the next in-breath. This short pause at the end of the out-breath often induces a natural relaxation response and can be particularly effective during high anxiety when the breathing tends to become rapid and continuous without any natural pauses. The Buddha also taught attention to the entire breathing process, noticing the beginning, middle, and end of each in-breath and out-breath. This detailed attention helps interrupt the thought patterns that feed fear, bringing the mind back to direct physical sensation rather than frightening stories about the past or future. For those experiencing panic attacks, breath awareness offers a concrete focus that can help break the escalating cycle of physical symptoms and fearful thoughts. When panic begins, the physical sensations, racing heart, tightness in the chest, dizziness, often trigger catastrophic thoughts like "I'm having a heart attack" or "I'm going to pass out," which in turn intensify the physical symptoms, creating a feedback loop of escalating panic. By gently shifting attention to the breath, we interrupt this cycle. Rather than getting caught in fearful interpretations of bodily sensations, we give the mind something neutral to focus on. The conscious regulation of breathing also directly counteracts the hyperventilation that often accompanies panic and creates many of its frightening symptoms. It's important to approach breath practices with a gentle, kind attitude, especially when working with fear. Trying to force the breath to conform to some ideal pattern can create additional tension. Instead, the approach is one of gentle invitation, encouraging the breath to gradually slow and deepen through patient attention rather than forceful control. For those new to breath awareness, guided practices can be particularly helpful. Having someone else's voice direct the attention and suggest gentle breathing patterns relieves the anxious mind of having to figure out the practice while in a state of fear. Many free resources exist that offer guided breathing meditations specifically designed for anxiety and panic. Regular practice of breath awareness during relatively calm times builds the skill so it's more accessible during moments of fear. Just 5 to 10 minutes of daily breath meditation creates neural pathways that make it easier to return to the breath when anxiety strikes. It's like building a muscle through regular exercise, so it's strong when you need it. The Buddha recommended practicing mindfulness of breathing in 4 stages: awareness of the breath itself, awareness of pleasant and unpleasant sensations that arise, awareness of the mind states that emerge, and finally, awareness of how all these experiences are impermanent and changing. This progression takes us from basic physical calming to deeper insights that transform our relationship with fear at its roots. What many people discover through regular breath practice is that the breath itself becomes a kind of refuge, a safe place to rest attention during difficult emotional states. Just knowing you have this resource available can reduce the meta-fear that often accompanies anxiety, the fear of the fear itself. Having a reliable method to work with fear when it arises builds confidence that you won't be completely overwhelmed, even by intense emotions. The effects of regular breath practice extend beyond immediate fear reduction. Over time, it helps regulate the autonomic nervous system more generally, creating a lower baseline of stress and reactivity. Many practitioners report that consistent breath meditation leads to a calmer default state, where they're less likely to be triggered into fear in the first place. Breath awareness also naturally cultivates the quality of presence, being fully in the here and now. Since fear predominantly involves thoughts about the future or past, this present moment awareness serves as a direct antidote. When fully present with the simple act of breathing, we temporarily step out of the narrative of fear that projects threats into an imagined future. While breathing techniques can be practiced as standalone methods, they become even more powerful when combined with other Buddhist approaches to fear. The physical calming that comes through breath awareness creates a foundation of stability from which we can then apply right understanding to examine the thought patterns generating fear. The two approaches, calming, and insight work together synergistically for a comprehensive approach to fear. While conscious breathing helps calm our nervous system during moments of fear, it's equally important to develop awareness of how fear manifests throughout the entire body. This brings us to another powerful Buddhist practice, the body scan meditation. This approach recognizes that fear isn't just a mental phenomenon, it's a whole body experience with distinct physical sensations that can be worked with directly through mindful awareness. Body scan meditation involves systematically moving your attention through different parts of the body, observing sensations with curiosity and without judgment, unlike breath meditation, which focuses primarily on one area of sensation. The body scan creates a comprehensive awareness of the entire physical experience, helping us identify exactly where and how fear manifests in our bodies. This practice draws from the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness of the body, Kayanupassana, which he described as a foundation for all insight. He recognized that our tendency to live in our heads, disconnected from bodily experience, creates conditions for suffering, including fear and anxiety. By re-establishing a mindful connection with our bodies, we develop a more integrated, stable presence that can hold fearful experiences with greater ease. For someone dealing with chronic fear or panic attacks, the body scan offers several specific benefits. First, it helps identify the earliest physical warning signs of fear, perhaps tension in the shoulders, a slight churning in the stomach, or a quickening pulse before they escalate into full-blown panic. Recognizing these early signals creates the opportunity to respond skillfully before fear takes over. Second, the body scan helps us distinguish between primary sensations and the secondary reactions we add to them. For example, you might notice tightness in your chest, primary sensation, and then observe how your mind immediately labels this as dangerous or scary, secondary reaction. By separating these elements of experience, you can be with the simple physical sensations without adding the layer of catastrophic thinking that amplifies fear. The practice itself is straightforward. You might begin by lying down or sitting comfortably and bringing attention to your feet. Notice any sensations present, tingling, pressure, temperature, or perhaps no strong sensation at all. Without trying to change anything, simply observe with friendly curiosity. Then gradually move your attention up through the body, ankles, calves, knees, thighs, and so on, all the way to the top of your head, bringing the same quality of curious, accepting awareness to each area. During this systematic exploration, you'll likely discover specific areas where fear tends to manifest for you. Common areas include the belly, chest, throat, and shoulders, though it varies widely between individuals. Some people experience fear primarily as chest tightness, others as a churning stomach, and still others as a sense of throat constriction. These patterns are often consistent across different fear episodes, creating a kind of physical signature of fear that becomes more recognizable with practice. What makes the body scan particularly effective for dissolving fear is that it counters our habitual tendency to dissociate from uncomfortable bodily sensations. When fear arises, many people automatically try to escape their bodies, distracting themselves, tensing against sensations, or getting lost in mental activity. This disconnection actually intensifies fear because the unknown and unexamined tends to be more frightening than what we're willing to face directly. By contrast, the body scan encourages us to move toward physical discomfort with gentle awareness. When we bring kind, curious attention to the sensations of fear in the body, something interesting happens. The sensations begin to change. What initially felt like a solid block of fear reveals itself as a collection of changing sensations, perhaps pulsing, vibrating, or fluctuating in intensity. This direct recognition of the impermanent nature of physical sensations helps dissolve the apparent solidity of fear. Another benefit of the body scan is its ability to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, especially when practiced with an attitude of gentle acceptance. As we systematically relax into awareness of each body part, we naturally begin to release unconscious tension patterns that contribute to chronic anxiety. This relaxation response counteracts the physical stress reaction associated with fear. For those who struggle with panic attacks, the body scan offers a way to work directly with the frightening physical symptoms that characterize panic. Many panic sufferers become hypervigilant about bodily sensations, interpreting normal variations in heart rate or minor discomforts as signs of impending disaster. The body scan helps recalibrate this relationship with bodily sensations, developing familiarity that reduces their threatening quality. Through regular practice, you might notice, for instance, that an increased heart rate doesn't automatically lead to panic when observed with mindful awareness. You begin to recognize that bodily sensations, in themselves, aren't dangerous. It's the fear-based interpretation and resistance that creates suffering. This insight can be tremendously liberating for those caught in cycles of panic and health anxiety. The body scan can be practiced formally as a meditation, perhaps for 20 to 30 minutes daily, or informally throughout the day by briefly checking in with bodily sensations, especially during stressful moments. Many people find it helpful to use guided body scan recordings when starting this practice, as the voice guidance helps keep attention from wandering into worry or planning. While the body scan is often practiced while lying down or sitting still, the principles can be applied during any activity. You might bring body scan awareness to washing dishes, walking to your car, or sitting in a meeting. This flexible application makes it a practical tool for daily life, not just formal meditation sessions. Research supports the effectiveness of body-based mindfulness practices for anxiety and fear. Studies show that regular body scan practice can reduce stress hormones, lower blood pressure, and decrease activity in brain regions associated with fear processing. These physiological changes correspond with subjective reports of greater calm and emotional stability. The Buddha taught that establishing mindfulness of the body leads to profound insights that liberate us from suffering. While the immediate benefit of the body scan may be reduced fear and anxiety, the long-term practice leads to deeper wisdom about the nature of embodied experience. We begin to recognize the body not as a fixed entity that needs constant protection from threat, but as a flowing process of sensation in constant change. This embodied awareness creates a foundation for all other Buddhist practices for working with fear. Without this grounding in direct physical experience, we risk approaching fear in an overly conceptual way that misses its lived reality. The body scan ensures our approach to fear is comprehensive, addressing both its physical and mental dimensions. As powerful as the body scan is, there are times when the energy of anxiety feels too intense to work with while sitting or lying still. During these moments, a more active approach can be tremendously helpful, which brings us to another traditional Buddhist practice, walking meditation. This approach is particularly well suited for working with anxiety and nervous energy that might feel overwhelming in more static forms of meditation. Walking meditation, known as kankama in Pali, combines conscious movement with present moment awareness. Unlike regular walking, where we're typically focused on getting somewhere, in walking meditation, the attention is on the experience of walking itself, the sensations of the feet touching the ground, the movement of the legs, the posture of the body, and the coordination of the whole walking process. The Buddha himself regularly practiced walking meditation, and Buddhist monasteries typically have dedicated walking paths where monks and nuns can practice this form for hours each day. The Buddha recommended walking meditation for its many benefits, including the development of concentration, physical health, and improved digestion. For those dealing with fear and anxiety, walking meditation offers these benefits plus the additional advantage of providing a constructive outlet for nervous energy. One of the challenges with sitting meditation during states of high anxiety is that the nervous system activation can feel overwhelming when the body is still. The mind races, the body feels charged with uncomfortable energy, and sitting through this can sometimes intensify rather than alleviate distress. Walking meditation allows for the discharge of this energy through rhythmic movement while still maintaining mindful awareness. The practice can be as simple as defining a walking path, perhaps 15 to 20 steps long, and walking back and forth at a pace that feels comfortable. With each step, bring full attention to the sensations in the feet and legs. You might notice the lifting of the foot, the movement through space, and the placing of the foot on the ground. Feel the shift of weight and the sensations of balance as you move from one foot to the other. For those experiencing high anxiety, it can be helpful to start with a slightly faster pace that matches your current energy level, then gradually slow down as the nervous energy begins to dissipate. The key is finding a pace that feels neither suppressive of your current state nor amplifies your agitation. With practice, you'll develop sensitivity to what pace serves you best in different states of mind. Coordinating the breath with your steps creates an additional layer of calming structure. You might experiment with breathing in for a certain number of steps and breathing out for the same or a different number. For example, breathing in for 2 steps and out for 3 can have a naturally calming effect. This coordination creates a gentle rhythm that helps settle an agitated mind. The physical sensations of the feet making contact with the ground provide particularly strong anchors for awareness. These sensations are usually quite distinct and easy to focus on, making them accessible even when the mind is scattered with anxious thoughts. With each step, you're literally and figuratively grounding yourself, countering the untethered feeling that often accompanies anxiety. What makes walking meditation especially valuable as a fear management tool is its versatility. It can be practiced almost anywhere, in your living room, in a hallway, in a park, or even adapted for a small space by walking very slowly in a circle or simply lifting and placing your feet while standing in place. This flexibility means it's available in many situations where anxiety might arise. You can also integrate elements of walking meditation into everyday activities. While walking to your car, walking down a hallway at work, or walking from room to room in your home, you can briefly bring the same quality of mindful awareness to the experience of walking. These short moments of practice throughout the day can interrupt anxiety cycles before they gain momentum. Many people find walking meditation more accessible than seated meditation, especially when beginning a mindfulness practice. There's less pressure to get it right, and the movement aspect feels more natural to those unaccustomed to sitting still in meditation. This accessibility makes it an excellent entry point for those who want to use Buddhist practices to work with fear but feel intimidated by more formal sitting practices. The alternating left-right pattern of walking has an additional benefit for anxiety sufferers. Research on bilateral stimulation, alternating activation of the left and right sides of the body, suggests it helps process emotional material and reduce its intensity. This may be one reason why walking often feels clarifying when we're upset or confused. The bilateral movement seems to help integrate emotional experiences. Walking meditation can also be practiced outdoors, adding the calming influence of nature to its benefits. The Buddha often recommended practicing in natural settings like forests, and modern research confirms that time in nature reduces stress hormones and anxiety levels. Combining mindful walking with time in natural environments creates a powerful intervention for fear and worry. For those who struggle with rumination, repetitive, worried thinking that fuels anxiety, walking meditation offers a way to step out of mental loops by bringing attention to direct physical experience. The varied sensations of walking provide rich alternatives to focus on besides anxious thoughts. Each time you notice the mind wandering into worry, you simply redirect attention to the physical experience of walking, the sensations of contact, movement, balance, and coordination. While walking, meditation is sometimes viewed as preliminary to real meditation. The Buddha himself regarded it as a complete practice in its own right, capable of leading to the deepest insights and freedom from suffering. He taught walking meditation as one of the 4 main postures for developing mindfulness, alongside sitting, standing, and lying down. This diversity of postures ensures that mindfulness becomes integrated into all physical activities, not just formal meditation sessions. With regular practice, walking meditation can transform your relationship with anxiety by providing a reliable method to work with nervous energy when it arises. Rather than fearing the physical activation that comes with anxiety, you develop confidence in your ability to channel this energy constructively through mindful movement. This confidence itself helps reduce the escalation of fear, as you no longer feel helpless in the face of anxiety's physical manifestations. While physical practices like walking meditation help us work with the bodily aspects of fear, we also need methods to address the thinking patterns that generate and sustain anxiety. This brings us to Buddhist cognitive reframing, systematic approaches for transforming negative thought patterns that create suffering. Unlike some modern therapeutic approaches that focus primarily on challenging the content of thoughts, Buddhist psychology offers insights into the nature of thinking itself and how we can relate to our thoughts in fundamentally different ways. The Buddha gave special attention to the role of thoughts in creating our experience, famously stating in the Dhammapada, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." He recognized that anxious, fearful thinking doesn't just reflect our reality, it actively shapes it. By learning to work skillfully with thinking patterns, we can transform our entire experience of fear. Central to Buddhist cognitive work is the practice of wise attention, yoniso manasikara in Pali. This involves consciously directing the mind toward helpful perspectives rather than letting it default to habitual patterns of anxious thinking. It's like having a skillful gatekeeper for the mind that discerns which thought patterns to encourage and which to gently redirect. For someone struggling with anxiety, wise attention might mean noticing when the mind is fixating on worst-case scenarios and deliberately shifting focus to more balanced or constructive perspectives. This isn't about suppressing negative thoughts or forcing positive thinking, but rather about recognizing unhelpful thinking patterns and choosing not to feed them with continued attention. A key insight from Buddhist psychology is the recognition that thoughts are just thoughts, not necessarily facts, not commands we must obey, and not direct reflections of reality. They're mental events that arise based on causes and conditions, many of which operate outside our conscious awareness. This perspective creates immediate freedom from the tyranny of anxious thinking by helping us see that we don't have to believe everything we think. When anxiety strikes, we can practice noting or labeling thoughts as simply thinking, or more specifically as worrying, planning, or catastrophizing. Why, this simple act of naming creates a small but crucial bit of space between ourselves and our thoughts, allowing us to see them as objects of awareness rather than absolute truths. With practice, we can observe thoughts arising and passing without being completely identified with or defined by them. Buddhist cognitive reframing also includes specific antidotes for common anxious thought patterns. For instance, when the mind is caught in fearful thinking about what others might think of us, we might deliberately contemplate the truth that all beings are concerned with their own suffering and happiness, just as we are. This universal human perspective helps reduce the self-centered anxiety that imagines we're constantly under others' scrutiny. For thoughts of inadequacy or failure that create performance anxiety, Buddhist practice suggests contemplating our inherent completeness and fundamental goodness that exists independent of achievements or others' approval. This isn't about inflating the ego, but recognizing a basic worthiness that doesn't depend on external validation or accomplishments. When anxious thinking involves excessive worry about the future, Buddhist reframing encourages bringing attention back to what's actually happening in this moment, recognizing that the fearful futures we envision exist only in thought, not in present reality. This present moment orientation naturally counteracts the future-oriented nature of most anxiety. What distinguishes Buddhist cognitive approaches from some modern methods is the emphasis on the ultimately empty nature of all concepts. Even the helpful perspectives we cultivate are recognized as provisional tools, not absolute truths. This prevents us from simply replacing one rigid thought system with another and keeps our relationship with thinking flexible and light. The Buddha recommended regular reflection on beneficial themes as a way to gradually recondition mental habits. Just as our minds have been conditioned toward fearful thinking through past experiences and cultural messaging, they can be reconditioned through intentional focus on alternative perspectives. This isn't a quick fix, but a gradual retraining of mental habits through consistent practice. Research in neuroplasticity confirms what Buddhist practitioners have known for centuries, that repeatedly directing attention toward particular thought patterns strengthens the neural pathways associated with those patterns. With time, more helpful ways of thinking become increasingly automatic, while anxious thought patterns gradually lose their dominant grip on the mind. Practically speaking, Buddhist cognitive reframing might involve setting aside time each day to consciously reflect on perspectives that counteract your particular patterns of fearful thinking. For example, if you frequently worry about what others think of you, you might regularly contemplate the truth that most people are primarily focused on their own concerns, not judging you. If you tend toward perfectionism that fuels anxiety, you might reflect daily on the value of mistakes as opportunities for learning and growth. These contemplations can be supported by phrases or questions that redirect thinking in more helpful directions. When caught in worry, you might ask yourself, is this thought helpful right now? Is it based on direct experience or assumption? What would be a more balanced perspective? These inquiries interrupt automatic anxious thinking and create space for wiser perspectives to emerge. Buddhist teachers also recommend being aware of the physical and emotional impact of different thought patterns. When caught in anxious thinking, we can notice how these thoughts affect our bodies and mood. Similarly, we can observe how more balanced or compassionate thinking influences our physical and emotional state. This awareness of consequences helps motivate the shift toward healthier thought patterns. It's important to approach Buddhist cognitive reframing with patience and self-compassion. Our anxious thinking patterns often developed as attempts to keep us safe, and they may have served important protective functions in the past. Recognizing this helps us work with these patterns gently rather than seeing them as enemies to be eliminated, which only creates more internal conflict. With consistent practice, Buddhist cognitive reframing gradually transforms our relationship with thinking itself. Rather than being dominated by automatic thought patterns that generate fear and anxiety, we develop a more intentional, wise relationship with the thinking process. Thoughts become tools we can use skillfully rather than forces that control us. This transformation creates a profound shift in our experience of fear and anxiety, as the mental component that amplifies and sustains fear loses its automatic power. While cognitive reframing helps us work with anxious thought patterns, Buddhist psychology also addresses a deeper cause of fear, our attachment to things being a certain way. This brings us to another powerful approach for working with fear, the practice of non-attachment or renunciation, Nakama in Pali. This principle offers profound insights into why we experience persistent fear and how we can find greater emotional freedom. Non-attachment is often misunderstood in Western contexts. It doesn't mean not caring or becoming emotionally detached in a cold or indifferent way. Rather, it refers to holding our experiences, relationships, possessions, and even our identities with an open hand rather than a tight grip. It's about caring deeply without clinging desperately. The Buddha identified attachment or clinging as the root cause of suffering, including the suffering of fear. When we become rigidly attached to having things a certain way, we naturally experience fear when those conditions are threatened. The more tightly we cling to particular outcomes, possessions, or identities, the more vulnerable we are to fear about their loss or change. Consider how many of your fears relate to potentially losing something you're attached to. Fear of losing a relationship, fear of failing at work and losing status, fear of losing health, fear of losing control, fear of losing comfort or convenience. Even fears that seem unrelated often have attachment at their root. Social anxiety, for instance, often stems from attachment to others' approval or to a particular self-image. The Buddha taught that because everything in life is impermanent, attachment inevitably leads to anxiety. When we demand permanence from an impermanent world or certainty in inherently uncertain conditions, we set ourselves up for constant fear, Soothe. By contrast, learning to hold life with a lighter touch creates a more flexible, resilient relationship with change and uncertainty. Practicing non-attachment doesn't mean giving up everything or withdrawing from life. Instead, it involves recognizing the pain that comes from clinging and gradually loosening our grip. We still engage fully with life, pursue meaningful goals, and form deep connections, but without the desperate grasping that generates so much fear. For example, you can work diligently toward career success while practicing non-attachment by focusing on giving your best effort without fixating on specific outcomes that are ultimately not entirely within your control. You still take appropriate action, but without the anxiety that comes from demanding that things must go exactly according to your plans. In relationships, non-attachment means loving deeply while respecting the other person's autonomy and the inevitable changes that occur in all relationships. This creates connections based on freedom rather than possession or control. Paradoxically, relationships with less clinging often feel more secure because they're built on acceptance of reality rather than desperate attempts to freeze relationships in one fixed state. With possessions, practicing non-attachment might involve enjoying what you have while maintaining awareness of their impermanent nature. You take care of your belongings without defining your worth or security by them. This perspective naturally reduces fears around loss or lack and creates a more balanced relationship with material things. Perhaps most importantly, non-attachment applies to our identities and self-concepts. Many fears revolve around threats to how we see ourselves or how we want others to see us. By holding our identities more lightly, recognizing that we are more than any fixed concept of self, we become less vulnerable to fears related to inadequacy, failure, rejection, or embarrassment. The practice of non-attachment can begin with simple reflection on the drawbacks of clinging. When you notice yourself feeling fearful about something, ask yourself, what am I clinging to here? What am I demanding must happen or not happen? Just recognizing the attachment patterns that underlie your fears creates space to begin loosening their grip. You can also practice deliberately letting go in small, manageable ways to develop the skill of non-attachment. This might involve giving away possessions you've been unnecessarily holding on to, practicing flexibility when plans change, or experimenting with not defending your opinions so rigidly in conversations. These small exercises build the muscle of holding life more lightly. Meditation practices that cultivate awareness of impermanence support non-attachment by helping us directly experience the changing nature of all phenomena. As we observe how sensations, thoughts, and emotions naturally arise and pass away, we develop greater comfort with flux and transition, reducing our instinctive resistance to change that generates so much fear. The Buddha also taught specific contemplations to counteract attachment. For instance, reflecting on the changing nature of possessions helps reduce materialistic clinging. Contemplating the inevitability of separation from loved ones, not in a morbid way, but as a recognition of reality, helps us appreciate relationships now while reducing the desperate clinging that creates fear of loss. It's worth noting that non-attachment develops gradually. Attempting to force yourself not to care about things that matter to you only creates an artificial detachment that usually masks deeper attachment. True non-attachment emerges naturally as we see more clearly the suffering that comes from clinging and experience the freedom that comes from holding life more lightly. As non-attachment develops, we begin to discover a sense of security that doesn't depend on external conditions being a certain way. This is what the Buddha called the island that cannot be flooded, an inner stability that remains even when outer circumstances change. This inner security naturally reduces fear because we're no longer placing our sense of safety in things that are inherently impermanent and unreliable. The freedom that comes through non-attachment doesn't mean we become passive or indifferent to life's challenges. In fact, it often leads to more effective action because we're operating from clarity rather than fear-based reactivity. We make decisions based on wisdom and compassion rather than desperate attempts to control outcomes or avoid discomfort. Perhaps most surprising to those new to this concept, practicing non-attachment often enhances our appreciation and enjoyment of life rather than diminishing it. When we're not grasping so tightly, we can actually be more fully present with experiences as they unfold. We enjoy pleasant experiences without the anxious undertone of trying to make them last forever. And we can meet challenging experiences with less resistance and fear. The practice of non-attachment creates psychological freedom by reducing the stakes of potential loss. When our happiness and sense of security aren't completely dependent on specific conditions, people, or outcomes, we naturally experience less fear about changes to those external factors. This doesn't mean we don't care, it means we care without the extra burden of desperate attachment that generates so much anxiety. While non-attachment helps us release the grip of clinging that creates fear, Buddhist practice offers another powerful approach that actively transforms fear by directing our attention outward: the cultivation of compassion, karuna. This practice shifts our focus from self-protection to concern for others' well-being, offering a profound antidote to the self-centered nature of most fear and anxiety. Compassion in Buddhist psychology is defined as the sincere wish that others be free from suffering. It's the heart's natural response of care when witnessing pain or difficulty. The Buddha taught compassion as one of the 4 divine abodes or sublime states of mind, Brahmaviharas, that liberate the heart from negative emotions like fear and hostility. What makes compassion particularly effective for working with fear is that fear and compassion represent fundamentally different orientations of mind. Fear constricts our awareness around self-protection, while compassion expands our awareness to include others. Fear separates us from others, while compassion connects us. Fear focuses on what might happen to me, while compassion directs attention to relieving others' actual suffering. This shift from self-focus to other focus can be immediately transformative during states of anxiety. When caught in fearful thinking, our awareness typically collapses around our own concerns, creating a sense of isolation that amplifies fear. By intentionally bringing to mind others who are suffering, perhaps in ways similar to or greater than our own, we break out of this isolating self-focus and reconnect with our natural capacity for care. The practice itself can take various forms. One approach involves bringing to mind someone who is suffering and sincerely wishing for their relief with phrases like, "May you be free from this suffering. May you find peace and well-being." These wishes can be extended gradually to wider circles of people, including those we don't know personally, those we find difficult, and ultimately all beings everywhere who experience fear and suffering. What many practitioners discover is that actively generating compassion for others actually helps alleviate their own fear. This isn't because they're suppressing or ignoring their fear, but because compassion naturally counteracts the self-centered rumination that fuels anxiety. It's difficult to remain completely absorbed in worried self-concern while sincerely wishing for others' well-being. Research supports this observation, showing that compassion practices activate brain regions associated with positive emotion and affiliative behavior while reducing activity in fear-processing areas. Studies have found that regular compassion meditation increases positive emotions, decreases anxiety, and improves relationships with others. These effects make sense when we consider that compassion shifts us from a threat-focused mindset to one of care and connection. For those dealing with specific fears, compassion practice can be tailored to directly address these concerns. For instance, if you struggle with social anxiety, you might practice compassion for others who share similar struggles, recognizing that many people experience the same fears of judgment or rejection. This recognition of common humanity helps reduce the isolating quality of social anxiety that makes it feel like I'm the only one who feels this way. Similarly, if you're experiencing health anxiety, you might practice compassion for all those currently dealing with actual illness or health challenges. This broader perspective helps shift from anxious self-preoccupation to a more balanced awareness that includes others' experiences. The heart naturally softens in response, creating emotional space around your own health concerns. A particularly powerful application of compassion involves extending it toward your own fear. Rather than fighting against fear or criticizing yourself for feeling afraid, you can meet fear itself with kindness and care. You might silently offer phrases like, "This is a moment of suffering. Fear is present right now. May I be kind to myself in this fear." This self-compassionate approach prevents the additional layer of suffering that comes from struggling against fear or judging yourself for feeling it. Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh suggests actually talking to your fear as you would to a frightened child, acknowledging its presence, offering reassurance, and staying present with it rather than abandoning it or fighting it. This compassionate dialogue transforms your relationship with fear from adversarial to nurturing, creating conditions where fear can naturally subside rather than escalate through resistance. What's particularly valuable about compassion practice is that it works even when fear has legitimate causes. Sometimes our fears are based on real threats or challenges, not just imagination. Compassion doesn't deny these realities, but provides a more balanced and effective way to relate to them. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, compassionate awareness motivates wise action that addresses actual problems while maintaining inner stability. The difference between fear-based and compassion-based responses to challenges is significant. Fear tends to narrow our options, triggering automatic fight-flight-freeze reactions that may not be appropriate to the situation. Compassion, on the other hand, expands our perspective and access to inner resources, allowing more creative and effective responses. We still recognize dangers when they exist, but we respond from care rather than panic. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, fear-based responses often led to hoarding supplies or completely avoiding necessary activities, while compassion-based approaches led to taking appropriate precautions while also considering others' needs. Both recognized the real threat, but compassion provided a more balanced foundation for response. Compassion practice can start small and grow gradually. You might begin with brief daily reflections on others' suffering and sincere wishes for their well-being. Even a few minutes daily begins to create new mental habits that counteract fear's self-focused rumination. With time, compassion becomes more automatic and accessible even during challenging moments of fear. Many people find it helpful to pair compassion practice with awareness of the breath. Perhaps imagining breathing in others' suffering without being overwhelmed by it, and breathing out relief or well-being. This combination of compassion and mindful breathing creates a stable practice that can be especially helpful during anxiety-provoking situations. What many discover through regular compassion practice is that caring for others' well-being actually helps us feel safer ourselves. This might seem counterintuitive. Shouldn't focusing on suffering increase our fear? But the opposite tends to occur. By connecting with our natural capacity for care beyond self-protection, we tap into a more fundamental sense of belonging and purpose that transcends individual fears. Through compassion practice, what gradually replaces fear isn't reckless disregard for legitimate dangers, but a courageous heart willing to stay present and responsive even in challenging circumstances. This heart recognizes suffering, both our own and others, without being overwhelmed by it, allowing us to respond with wisdom rather than panic or avoidance. While compassion connects us more deeply with ourselves and others, Buddhist practice also cultivates another quality that creates profound emotional stability in the face of fear: equanimity, upekkha in Pali. Equanimity is often described as the balanced mind that remains steady amidst life's inevitable ups and downs. It's not indifference or detachment, but rather a spacious presence that can hold all experiences, including fear, without being overwhelmed or pulled off center. The Buddha taught equanimity as the fourth of the Brahmaviharas, or divine abodes, considering it the most mature and refined of these heart qualities. While loving kindness, compassion, and appreciative joy connect us more deeply with ourselves and others, equanimity provides the balanced foundation that prevents these heart qualities from becoming distorted by preference, aversion, or overwhelm. For those dealing with fear and anxiety, equanimity offers several specific benefits. First, it helps us stay present with fear without being consumed by it, rather than getting caught in fearful thinking or trying to escape the experience. Equanimity allows us to acknowledge fear's presence while maintaining inner stability. This creates space around the fear experience, preventing it from completely dominating our awareness. Equanimity also helps us recognize that emotional states, including fear, arise and pass according to conditions. The equanimous mind understands that we don't need to identify with fear as my fear or get caught in stories about why we shouldn't be afraid. Instead, we can see fear as a natural response arising due to causes and conditions, which significantly reduces shame or secondary distress about experiencing fear. One of the traditional contemplations for developing equanimity involves reflecting on karma, the understanding that beings experience results according to their actions. While we can wish all beings well, including ourselves, we recognize that experiences unfold based on countless conditions, many beyond our immediate control. This perspective helps reduce the anxiety that comes from believing we should be able to control all outcomes or protect ourselves from all possible difficulties. For example, when facing uncertainty about a job interview outcome, equanimity helps us recognize that results depend on many factors beyond our complete control. We can prepare thoroughly and present ourselves well, but the final decision involves others' preferences, needs, and countless other variables. Rather than anxiously trying to control the uncontrollable, equanimity allows us to do our best while accepting that ultimate outcomes aren't entirely up to us. The practice of equanimity doesn't mean we don't care about results or become passive. Instead, it involves wise discernment about what's within our control and what isn't. We put appropriate effort into what we can influence while releasing the anxious grip on what we can't. This balanced approach prevents the exhaustion and fear that come from constantly trying to control everything. Equanimity practice often begins with phrases that remind us of this balanced perspective. All beings are owners of their karma. Their happiness depends on their actions, not my wishes for them. These reflections can be applied to ourselves as well. My experience unfolds according to many conditions. I can influence but not completely control what happens. When working specifically with fear, equanimity helps us avoid both suppressing fear and being overwhelmed by it, finding the middle path that acknowledges fear's presence without giving it more power than it deserves. We learn to be with fear without feeding it with stories, resistance, or identification. A concrete practice for developing equanimity involves noticing our habitual reactions to pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral experiences. We typically grasp at pleasant experiences, wanting them to stay or increase, resist unpleasant experiences, wanting them to end or decrease, and ignore neutral experiences, missing them altogether or trying to make them more interesting. By consciously working against these habitual reactions, not clinging to the pleasant, not pushing away the unpleasant, and bringing interested attention to the neutral, we gradually develop greater equanimity. This balanced relationship with experience naturally reduces the fear that stems from desperately seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. For those who experience panic attacks, equanimity offers a particularly valuable perspective. A key feature of panic is the catastrophic interpretation of bodily sensations and the desperate attempt to make these sensations stop. Equanimity provides an alternative response, acknowledging uncomfortable sensations without catastrophizing or fighting against them. This non-reactive awareness often allows sensations to rise and fall naturally without escalating into full panic. Research suggests that equanimity involves specific brain patterns characterized by balanced activity between approach and avoidance systems, as well as regulated activity in emotion processing regions. Studies of long-term meditators show they maintain this neural balance even when exposed to distressing stimuli, demonstrating equanimity's protective effect against emotional reactivity. The development of equanimity doesn't happen overnight. It's cultivated through consistent practice and life experience. Each time we stay present with a challenging emotion like fear without being overwhelmed by it, we strengthen this quality. Each time we face uncertainty without falling into excessive worry or control efforts, equanimity grows. What many practitioners discover is that equanimity creates a profound sense of inner freedom. When we're not constantly driven by the need to acquire pleasant experiences and avoid unpleasant ones, we find a spaciousness that can accommodate all of life's changing conditions. Fear loses much of its grip because we're no longer desperately trying to maintain certain states and avoid others. This balanced mind sees fear as just one of many emotions that naturally arise and pass in human experience, neither suppressing it as unacceptable nor allowing it to dominate as all-important. With equanimity, fear becomes just another cloud passing through the sky of awareness, sometimes darker or larger than others, but never defining the entire sky. Perhaps most importantly, true equanimity isn't cold indifference but rather a warm, inclusive presence that can hold all experiences with care. It's often described as a grandparent watching children play, caring deeply about their well-being while maintaining a broader perspective that isn't caught up in every momentary drama. This balance of care and perspective creates ideal conditions for relating skillfully to fear without being controlled by it. While equanimity provides emotional stability in the face of fear, Buddhist psychology also offers specific insights into the common mental patterns that fuel anxiety. This brings us to another practical framework: awareness of the 5 hindrances. These hindrances represent universal mental states that obscure clear seeing and contribute significantly to fear and anxiety. By recognizing which hindrances are active in our experience, we can work more skillfully with the specific patterns that generate and sustain fear. The Buddha identified 5 primary hindrances that cloud the mind: sensory desire, aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and doubt. While all can contribute to suffering, restlessness and worry, udakakukucha in Pali, most directly relates to anxiety and fear. This hindrance manifests as an agitated mind that can't settle, constantly jumping from one worry to another, often accompanied by physical restlessness and nervous energy. Anyone who's experienced anxiety will immediately recognize this state: the racing thoughts that won't quiet down, the physical jitteriness, the sense that you can't fully rest or focus because part of your mind is constantly scanning for threats or problems. This restless worry creates a cycle where anxious thoughts generate physical tension, which then reinforces more anxious thinking. What makes the 5 hindrances framework so helpful is that the Buddha didn't just name these mental states, he provided specific antidotes for each one. For restlessness and worry, he recommended several approaches that directly calm the agitated mind. Practices that develop concentration and physical relaxation are particularly effective, such as focusing on the breath or body sensations with steady, gentle attention. The Buddha also recommended developing contentment as an antidote to the mind's tendency to become restless with wanting things to be different than they are. This contentment isn't passive resignation, but rather a genuine appreciation for what's already present, which naturally settles the agitated energy of constantly seeking something other than what's here now. Another powerful antidote is to directly investigate the nature of worry itself. When caught in anxious thinking, we can turn our attention to questions like, what's the feeling tone of worry? How does it manifest in my body? What beliefs underlie this worry? This investigation turns worry from something happening to us into an object of mindful awareness, immediately changing our relationship with it. Aversion, another of the 5 hindrances, also plays a significant role in anxiety. It manifests as resistance to what's happening, irritation, or the mind's attempt to push away unwanted experiences. With fear and anxiety, aversion often shows up as resistance to the fear itself. We feel afraid, and then we resist feeling afraid, creating a second layer of suffering on top of the original fear. The antidote to aversion is cultivating acceptance and goodwill. This doesn't mean we passively endure harmful situations, but rather that we stop fighting against reality as it is in this moment. With fear, this means acknowledging, yes, fear is present right now, rather than struggling against it with thoughts like, I shouldn't be afraid, or I need to get rid of this fear immediately. Doubt, the 5th hindrance, can also feed anxiety, particularly when we're uncertain about how to handle challenging situations or whether we have the capacity to face our fears. This doubt manifests as confusion, indecisiveness, and lack of confidence in ourselves or the practices we're using to work with fear. The traditional antidote to doubt is seeking clarity through learning, asking questions, and direct experimentation. Rather than remaining stuck in uncertainty about whether you can handle fear or whether a particular approach will help, you gather information and test methods directly in your experience. This active engagement cuts through the paralysis that doubt can create. While each hindrance has specific antidotes, the Buddha taught that awareness itself is the most fundamental remedy. Simply recognizing, restlessness is present right now, or I notice doubt arising, immediately changes our relationship with these states. Instead of being completely identified with the hindrance, we create some space around it through recognition, weakening its grip on our minds. This awareness practice is particularly valuable for anxiety because it helps us catch the early warning signs before fear escalates. Many people don't notice anxiety until it's already quite intense. But with practice in recognizing the hindrances, you might notice subtle restlessness or worry arising earlier in the process. This early recognition creates the opportunity to respond skillfully before the anxiety gains momentum. The 5 hindrances framework also helps normalize these challenging mental states. Rather than seeing anxiety as a personal failing or something wrong with you specifically, you recognize that restlessness and worry are universal human experiences, mental patterns that have affected humans for thousands of years. This recognition reduces the shame and isolation that often accompany anxiety, which itself can help prevent fear from escalating. For practical application, you might take a few moments each day to check in with which hindrances are present in your mind. This regular inventory develops metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own mental patterns. You might ask, is there restlessness or worry present right now? Is there aversion to my experience? Is doubt affecting my mind? This simple practice gradually builds the habit of noticing these patterns earlier and more easily, when working specifically with fear and anxiety. Paying attention to the relationship between different hindrances can be revealing. Often they work together to intensify suffering. For instance, you might notice restless worry arising, then aversion to that uncomfortable state, followed by doubt about whether you'll ever feel better. Seeing these connections helps interrupt the cycle rather than getting caught in escalating distress. The Buddha compared the mind affected by the hindrances to water that's been altered in various ways: coloured with dye, sensory desire; boiling over a fire, aversion; covered with algae, sloth and torpor; whipped up by the wind, restlessness and worry; or muddied and placed in darkness, doubt. Just as these conditions prevent us from seeing our reflection clearly in water, the hindrances prevent us from seeing reality clearly, which naturally generates confusion and fear. The good news is that hindrances are temporary states, not permanent characteristics of our minds. With proper attention and the appropriate antidotes, they gradually lose their power to dominate our experience. Each time we recognize a hindrance and work skillfully with it instead of being controlled by it, we strengthen our capacity for clarity and peace, even in challenging circumstances. Understanding the 5 hindrances and their antidotes provides practical tools for working with the specific mental patterns that generate fear. But Buddhist practice also offers something more fundamental: a reliable source of safety and support that we can turn to during frightening times. This brings us to the practice of taking refuge in the 3 jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, which provides psychological safety amidst life's uncertainties. Taking refuge is the foundational practice of Buddhism, traditionally the first step for anyone beginning on the Buddhist path. While often understood in religious terms, the practice has profound psychological implications, especially for those working with fear and anxiety. It provides orientation, protection, and support when we feel vulnerable or overwhelmed. The first refuge is the Buddha, which represents both the historical Buddha who taught the path to freedom from suffering and our own innate capacity for awakening beyond fear. Taking refuge in the Buddha means remembering our fundamental potential for clarity, wisdom, and fearlessness that exists beneath the layers of conditioning and reactivity. It's a reminder that freedom from the grip of fear is possible because others have achieved it, and the same capacity exists within us. When anxiety strikes, reconnecting with this refuge might involve bringing to mind the image or qualities of the Buddha, his calm presence, clear seeing, and compassionate response to all situations. Or it might involve remembering your own moments of clarity and wisdom, recognizing that the fear doesn't define your entire being. There's a knowing awareness that can hold even intense fear with steadiness. The second refuge is the Dharma, which refers to the Buddha's teachings and the truth they point to. This includes all the practical methods we've been exploring for working with fear, as well as the underlying principles like impermanence, non-self, and the possibility of freedom from suffering. Taking refuge in the Dharma means trusting that there are reliable principles and practices that can guide us through even the most frightening experiences. During moments of fear or panic, reconnecting with this refuge might involve remembering a specific teaching or practice that has helped you before, such as mindful breathing, recognizing impermanence, or extending compassion to your own suffering. The Dharma provides concrete, tested methods rather than leaving us to figure everything out on our own during overwhelming moments. The third refuge is the Sangha, which traditionally refers to the community of practitioners on the path. This includes both historical examples of those who have transformed fear through practice and contemporary communities of support. Taking refuge in the Sangha reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles with fear. Countless others have walked this path before us, and many walk alongside us now. Connecting with this refuge during anxious times might involve reaching out to a friend who understands your practice, attending a meditation group, or simply remembering that many others experience similar fears and are working with them using these same approaches. This recognition of shared humanity counters the isolating effect of fear, which often makes us feel we're uniquely broken or uniquely threatened. Research in psychology confirms the importance of secure attachment and social support for managing anxiety. When we feel connected to reliable sources of safety and understanding, our nervous systems naturally regulate more effectively, The three refugees provide exactly these secure attachments to our own potential for awakening, to reliable methods that work, and to a community of support. The practice of taking refuge isn't about escaping difficulty through blind faith or magical thinking. Rather, it's about orienting ourselves toward genuine sources of safety and wisdom when fear threatens to disorient us. It's like having trusted guides when navigating challenging terrain. Their presence doesn't eliminate the challenges, but it provides direction and support that makes the journey more manageable. Taking refuge can be practiced formally through reciting traditional refuge verses, either silently or aloud. I take refuge in the Buddha, the one who shows the way in this life. I take refuge in the Dharma, the way of understanding and love. I take refuge in the Sangha, the community that lives in harmony and awareness. This recitation helps embed these sources of support in our awareness so they're more accessible during difficult moments. Informal refuge practice happens whenever we consciously connect with these sources of support in daily life. This might mean pausing to remember your fundamental Buddha nature when fear arises, turning to a specific Dharma practice when feeling overwhelmed, or reaching out to a supportive friend or community member when facing a challenging situation. What makes refuge practice particularly valuable for those dealing with chronic anxiety is that it provides orientation and support without requiring that the fear immediately disappears. Many approaches to anxiety can subtly reinforce the idea that fear is unacceptable and must be eliminated, which creates additional pressure and self-judgment. Refuge practice offers support and direction even while fear is present, reducing the additional suffering that comes from feeling we must first be fearless before we can find peace. Over time, regular connection with the three refugees creates what psychologists might call internalized secure attachment, an inner sense of safety and support that remains accessible even when external circumstances feel threatening. This inner security doesn't eliminate appropriate caution in genuinely dangerous situations, but it reduces the chronic background anxiety that stems from a fundamental sense of insecurity and isolation. For those whose fear relates to uncertainty about their path in life or major decisions, the three refugees provide valuable guidance. Rather than being paralyzed by doubt or making decisions from a place of panic, we can align our choices with our deepest values, Buddha, wise principles, Dharma, and consult with trusted others who share our aspirations, Sangha. This approach leads to decisions grounded in wisdom rather than fear. The refugees also offer protection against what Buddhists call the worldly winds, the inevitable ups and downs of praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. When our sense of security depends entirely on favorable external conditions, we're constantly vulnerable to fear when those conditions change. The refugees provide a more reliable foundation that doesn't depend on everything going our way. Taking refuge isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing practice that deepens over time. Each time we turn toward these sources of support instead of getting lost in fear, we strengthen our connection with them. Gradually, they become our default orientation rather than something we have to consciously remember in moments of crisis. The practice of taking refuge provides psychological safety amidst life's uncertainties, but we still need practical guidance on how to relate to fear when it arises. This brings us to another key Buddhist approach, the middle way philosophy applied to working with fear. The middle way represents one of the Buddha's core insights, the understanding that freedom from suffering comes not through extremes but through a balanced, nuanced approach that avoids the pitfalls of both indulgence and suppression. When applied to fear, the middle way offers a refreshingly balanced alternative to our typical responses. Most of us habitually react to fear in one of two extreme ways, either by suppressing and avoiding it, pretending we're not afraid when we are, or by becoming completely overwhelmed and defined by it, letting fear control our decisions and outlook. Neither approach leads to genuine freedom from fear's grip. The middle way approach acknowledges fear while not allowing it to dominate our lives. It means recognizing when fear arises, validating its presence without judgment, but also maintaining enough perspective to question whether the fear's message is accurate and proportional to the actual situation. This balanced stance prevents us from either ignoring important warning signals or being controlled by exaggerated fears. For example, if you experience fear about a health symptom, the middle way approach would involve neither ignoring the symptom completely, suppression, nor immediately assuming the worst possible diagnosis and becoming consumed with panic, indulgence. Instead, you would acknowledge the concern, take appropriate action like consulting a doctor if warranted, while maintaining enough emotional balance to function effectively and keep the concern in perspective. The Buddha described his own pre-enlightenment experiences with extreme approaches, trying both severe self-mortification and sensual indulgence before discovering that neither led to liberation. With fear, we face a similar pattern. We might swing between rigid self-control that denies fear and complete surrender to fear's worst projections. The middle way offers the balanced alternative that leads to genuine transformation. This balanced approach is particularly valuable because fear often contains a mixture of valid information and distortion. Some fears signal genuine threats that require attention, while others reflect conditioned patterns from past experiences or exaggerated projections about the future. The middle way helps us discern the difference, neither dismissing all fears as irrational nor accepting all fearful thoughts as accurate reflections of reality. In practice, applying the middle way to fear might involve asking questions like, what's the kernel of wisdom in this fear that I should listen to? What part seems exaggerated or based on past conditioning rather than present reality? What would a balanced response look like, one that neither ignores legitimate concerns nor amplifies them beyond proportion? The Buddha taught that right effort involves both preventing and abandoning unwholesome states while cultivating and maintaining wholesome ones. With fear, this means we don't try to eliminate appropriate caution that protects us from genuine dangers, but we work to transform the unnecessary suffering that comes from exaggerated or misplaced fears. We develop discernment about which fears serve a protective function and which merely limit our lives unnecessarily. One practical application of the middle way involves examining how we relate to uncertainty, which underlies many fears. Most of us habitually lean toward either excessive certainty, pretending we know what will happen when we don't, or excessive uncertainty, feeling we can never know anything for sure, leading to constant doubt. The middle way embraces appropriate confidence based on evidence while maintaining openness to new information, a balanced relationship with not knowing. For instance, with pandemic-related fears, the middle way approach would avoid both reckless denial of risk and paralyzing preoccupation with every possible danger. It would involve following sound health guidance while maintaining perspective about relative risks and continuing to engage with life in modified but meaningful ways. This balanced approach prevents both the harm that comes from ignoring real threats and the suffering that comes from being consumed by fear. The middle way also applies to how we view ourselves in relation to fear. Many people define their identity either in opposition to fear, I'm not the kind of person who gets afraid, or as fundamentally fearful, I'm just an anxious person, that's who I am. The middle way recognizes that fear is a universal human experience that visits everyone at times but doesn't define anyone completely. This balanced self-view prevents both the inauthenticity of denying fear and the limitation of being defined by it. When working with specific fears, the middle way often translates into gradual, step-by-step approaches rather than either complete avoidance or extreme exposure. For instance, if someone fears public speaking, neither avoiding all speaking opportunities nor forcing oneself into the most challenging speaking situation immediately would represent the middle way. Instead, a graduated approach that builds confidence through increasingly challenging but manageable experiences embodies balanced effort. This balanced approach to fear doesn't mean splitting the difference between extremes in a mechanical way or always finding some lukewarm middle ground. Rather, it involves dynamic, responsive wisdom that adjusts to each situation's unique requirements. Sometimes this might mean leaning more toward careful protection when dangers are real and significant. Other times it might mean encouraging more boldness when fears are clearly exaggerated. What distinguishes the middle way approach to fear is that it's not driven by fear itself, but by wisdom and compassion. When we're caught in fear, we typically react based on that fear, either by fighting against it or surrendering to it. The middle way represents a different relationship altogether, one based on clearer seeing and kind attention that's neither dominated by fear nor in opposition to it. This balanced relationship with fear develops through consistent practice. Each time we catch ourselves either suppressing fear or being overwhelmed by it, and consciously choose a more balanced approach instead, we strengthen this middle way capacity. Over time, this more nuanced relationship with fear becomes more natural and accessible, even during challenging circumstances. What many practitioners discover is that the middle way approach to fear actually leads to greater courage than either extreme. When we neither deny fear nor become consumed by it, we develop the ability to act wisely even when fear is present. This isn't fearlessness as an absence of fear, but fearlessness as the capacity to move forward with appropriate action regardless of whether fear arises. This balanced approach to working with fear naturally leads us to another powerful Buddhist method that embodies middle way principles: mindful exposure to what we fear, rather than perpetually avoiding what frightens us. Buddhist practice often involves gradually and mindfully facing our fears directly. This approach parallels modern exposure therapy in psychology, but includes some distinctive elements that make it particularly effective. The basic principle is simple but profound. When we avoid what we fear, the fear typically grows stronger. When we face what we fear with mindful awareness, the fear gradually diminishes. Avoidance may provide short-term relief, but ultimately reinforces the belief that what we fear is too dangerous or overwhelming to face, which strengthens the fear's grip in the long run. The Buddha himself encouraged this approach. In one famous discourse, he advised monks who were afraid to meditate in the forest to confront their fears directly. "I advise you to go to that same forest, to that same foot of a tree, to that same empty hut, and continue with your meditation." Rather than suggesting they find a less frightening location, he encouraged them to face their fears with mindful awareness, knowing this direct encounter would lead to greater freedom. Buddhist mindful exposure differs from simply forcing oneself into frightening situations, which can be re-traumatizing and unhelpful. The key elements that make this approach effective include gradual, step-by-step progression from less to more challenging situations, maintaining mindful awareness throughout the exposure, bringing an attitude of kind curiosity rather than harsh self-criticism, and having appropriate support and guidance through the process. For someone with social anxiety, for example, mindful exposure might begin with brief, limited social interactions observed with gentle awareness, gradually working up to more challenging social situations as comfort increases. The emphasis throughout is on maintaining mindfulness of the actual experience rather than getting caught in projections about what might happen or judgments about how you're doing. During exposure, the practitioner pays attention to the physical sensations of fear, the thoughts that arise, and the emotions present, all with an attitude of interested investigation rather than aversion. This mindful awareness helps break the automatic cycle of reactivity that typically amplifies fear. Rather than getting caught in thoughts like, "this is terrible," or "I can't handle this," the practitioner observes the experience as a series of changing sensations, thoughts, and emotions without being defined by them. What makes the Buddhist approach to exposure particularly powerful is its foundation in ethical conduct, sila. Before encouraging practitioners to face their fears, the Buddha emphasized the importance of living with integrity and kindness. This ethical foundation provides genuine confidence based on knowing your own goodness and trustworthiness, which creates inner stability when facing frightening situations. For instance, if you know you consistently treat others with respect and kindness, social situations become less threatening because you have less reason to fear that you'll behave in ways you'd later regret. This doesn't eliminate all social anxiety, but it reduces a significant source of fear, doubt about your own conduct. This is why in traditional Buddhist practice, ethical guidelines precede meditation and other mind training techniques. Buddhist mindful exposure also emphasizes the wisdom aspect of working with fear. As you mindfully face what frightens you, you gather direct, experiential information about the actual threat level versus your perceived threat level. This helps distinguish between realistic concerns that warrant caution and exaggerated fears based on past conditioning or misperception. For example, someone with a fear of flying might discover through mindful exposure that while flying does involve some discomfort and legitimate risks, the catastrophic outcomes they imagined rarely, if ever, occur. This direct experience is far more convincing to the emotional brain than logical arguments about airline safety statistics, gradually recalibrating the fear response to better match reality. The practice of mindful exposure can be applied to various types of fears, with phobias like fear of heights, spiders, or confined spaces. The gradual exposure approach is straightforward, starting with less threatening versions and progressively moving toward more challenging situations while maintaining mindful awareness throughout. For more complex fears like health anxiety or existential fears about uncertainty, the exposure involves gradually facing the thoughts and bodily sensations that trigger fear rather than external situations. Someone with health anxiety, for instance, might practice mindfully being with the uncomfortable sensations in their body without immediately seeking reassurance or medical consultation, gradually learning that sensations can be present without representing danger. An important aspect of Buddhist mindful exposure is that it's undertaken voluntarily as part of a path of practice, not forced or imposed. The practitioner recognizes the value of facing fears as a way to greater freedom and chooses to engage with the process out of commitment to their own well-being and growth. This sense of agency and purpose makes a significant difference in the effectiveness of the approach compared to exposure that feels externally mandated. The benefits of mindful exposure extend beyond reducing specific fears. Many practitioners report a general increase in confidence and resilience that transfers to other life challenges. Having successfully faced fears directly, they develop trust in their capacity to handle difficult situations, which reduces background anxiety about what might happen in the future. Buddhist teachers often recommend working with a knowledgeable guide when undertaking exposure to significant fears. This might be a meditation teacher, therapist, or experienced practitioner who can help design an appropriate graduated approach, offer support during challenging moments, and provide perspective when the mind gets caught in old patterns of fearful thinking. With consistent practice, mindful exposure leads to a profound shift in our relationship with fear. Rather than organizing our lives around avoiding what frightens us, we develop the capacity to move toward our fears with awareness and courage. This doesn't mean seeking out frightening experiences unnecessarily, but rather not letting fear become the primary determining factor in our life choices. What many discover through this practice is not just reduced fear about specific triggers, but a more fundamental confidence in their ability to be with fear itself when it arises. This confidence doesn't come from believing nothing frightening will ever happen, but from knowing from direct experience that they can face whatever comes with presence and clarity. This is the true freedom that Buddhist practice offers, not a life without fear, but a life no longer limited by fear. While mindful exposure helps us directly face our fears, the path of transformation isn't meant to be walked alone. This brings us to another powerful aspect of Buddhist practice: the role of Sangha and community support in dispelling the isolation that often accompanies fear. the Buddha recognized the profound importance of supportive community, famously stating that noble friendship and association is not merely a part of the spiritual path, but the whole of the holy life. Fear tends to isolate us, creating the sense that we're alone in our struggles or somehow uniquely broken compared to others. This isolation itself amplifies fear, as we lose the regulating influence of supportive human connection and the perspective that comes from knowing others face similar challenges. A supportive community provides both practical guidance and emotional holding that makes working with fear more manageable and less overwhelming. The traditional Buddhist Sangha refers to the community of practitioners following the Buddha's path, while this originally meant the ordained community of monks and nuns. The term has expanded in modern usage to include any group of people practicing together with shared values and intentions. For those working with fear and anxiety, finding or creating such a community provides invaluable support that counteracts the isolating effects of fear. In practical terms, community support works on multiple levels to help transform fear. On the most basic level, simply being around others who remain calm and grounded during moments when you feel afraid has a direct regulating effect on your nervous system. Neuroscience research confirms that our emotional states are highly contagious and that we unconsciously attune to the nervous system states of those around us. Being in the presence of others who embody stability and peace naturally helps calm our own fear response. Community also provides crucial perspective when fear distorts our thinking. When caught in anxiety, our minds typically generate worst-case scenarios and exaggerated assessments of threat. Trusted friends or fellow practitioners can offer reality checking that helps counterbalance these distortions. Sometimes simply expressing our fears aloud to an attentive listener helps us recognize their exaggerated nature, bringing us back to a more balanced perspective. For instance, someone experiencing health anxiety might become convinced that a minor symptom indicates a serious disease, with their mind generating increasingly catastrophic possibilities. Sharing these fears with a grounded friend often helps reveal the mind's catastrophizing tendency, not because the friend dismisses legitimate concerns, but because voicing fears aloud in a supportive context helps activate our own wisdom and perspective. The shared practices of a spiritual community also create a container for working with fear. Group meditation, for example, often feels more accessible than solitary practice during periods of intense anxiety. The collective energy and commitment of the group helps sustain the practice even when fear makes it difficult to maintain focus or discipline on your own. There's a palpable support that comes from practicing alongside others, even when done in silence. Buddhist communities typically combine practice with study and discussion, which provides intellectual frameworks and practical guidance for working with fear. Hearing how others apply Buddhist principles to their own fear and anxiety offers both inspiration and concrete techniques you might not discover on your own. This collective wisdom accelerates learning and helps prevent the discouragement that can come from trying to figure everything out by yourself. Perhaps most importantly, authentic spiritual community helps normalize the experience of fear without pathologizing it. In a culture that often treats anxiety as either a personal failing or a medical condition requiring expert intervention, Sangha provides a middle way, recognizing fear as a universal human experience that can be worked with through practice and with supportive companionship. This normalization itself reduces the shame and secondary suffering that often accompany fear. The Buddha recommended specific qualities to look for in spiritual friends, including virtue, generosity, wisdom, and a willingness to speak candidly but kindly about areas needing improvement. For those working with fear, finding friends who embody these qualities creates relationships where both support and gentle challenge can be offered. Such friends neither indulge our fear-based patterns by going along with them uncritically, nor invalidate our experience by dismissing legitimate concerns. Community support becomes particularly crucial during major life transitions or crises when fear naturally intensifies. During times of serious illness, loss of a loved one, financial hardship, or other significant challenges. Having a community that understands your values and practices creates a safety net that helps prevent fear from becoming overwhelming. The knowledge that you're not facing difficulties alone provides both practical and emotional reassurance. Many Buddhist communities incorporate formal practices that directly address fear through collective support. Some traditions practice fear touching, where practitioners openly acknowledge their fears in a group setting and receive validation and support. Others include specific liturgies or chants focused on protection and fearlessness, using the power of unified voice and intention to strengthen courage and stability. Creating or finding appropriate community support may require some initiative, especially for those new to Buddhist practice. This might involve joining an established meditation group, taking classes at a local Buddhist center, or even forming a small informal group of friends interested in exploring these practices together. Online communities can also provide valuable connection, particularly for those in areas without easy access to in-person Buddhist groups. The quality of community matters as much as its existence. Not all groups provide the kind of supportive environment that helps transform fear. Communities based on rigid hierarchy, judgment, or spiritual competitiveness may actually increase anxiety rather than alleviate it. Healthy spiritual communities maintain a balance of acceptance and aspiration, accepting each person exactly as they are while supporting their growth and transformation. For those whose anxiety specifically involves social interaction, community practice offers a particularly valuable opportunity for gradual exposure in a relatively safe context. Meditation groups typically involve periods of both silence and social interaction, creating a structured environment where social engagement can be practiced in limited doses with people who share similar values. The focus on practice rather than social performance helps reduce the self-consciousness that often drives social anxiety. Buddhist communities also provide important role models of people further along the path of working with fear. Seeing others who have transformed their relationship with fear through practice offers living proof that such transformation is possible. These examples inspire hope during difficult periods when progress feels slow or uncertain. As the saying goes, we can only go as far as we can imagine. And seeing others embodying greater freedom from fear expands our sense of what's possible. The Buddha himself recognized that suitable community wasn't just helpful but essential for most practitioners. When his attendant Ananda suggested that good friendship seemed to be half of the spiritual life, the Buddha corrected him, saying it was actually the whole of the spiritual life. This underscores how central supportive relationships are to the path of transformation, including the transformation of our relationship with fear. While community support provides the relational context for working with fear, Buddhist practice also offers powerful methods for directly investigating the nature of fear itself. This brings us to vipassana, or insight meditation, which involves seeing clearly into the nature of fear and its components. Rather than just calming fear or developing resources to cope with it, vipassana helps deconstruct fear entirely, revealing its empty, impermanent nature. Vipassana represents the Buddha's unique contribution to contemplative practice. While concentration methods that calm and focus the mind existed before the Buddha, the systematic development of insight that leads to liberation was his distinctive teaching. This approach involves using the stable, focused mind to investigate the true nature of experience, including challenging states like fear. The practice begins with establishing mindful awareness of whatever arises in experience, physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, and perceptions. With fear specifically, this means paying careful attention to all aspects of the fear experience as it manifests, rather than treating fear as a solid entity or trying to make it go away. The practitioner investigates it with interested curiosity. What is this fear actually made of? How does it manifest in direct experience? This investigation typically reveals that what we call fear isn't a solid, monolithic thing, but rather a complex process involving various components, physical sensations like tightness or trembling, thoughts that predict danger or negative outcomes, emotional tones of aversion or contraction, and perhaps mental images of threatening scenarios. By recognizing these components, fear becomes less overwhelming and more workable. Instead of facing a seemingly solid wall of fear, we're dealing with distinct elements that can be observed more clearly. The insight approach also involves noticing the impermanent, changing nature of these fear components. We observe how sensations shift and change. Tension might increase, then decrease. Heart rate rises and falls. Trembling comes and goes. Thoughts appear and disappear, sometimes repeating but never actually remaining static. The emotional tone itself fluctuates in intensity. This direct perception of impermanence helps counter the mind's tendency to perceive fear as a permanent, unchanging state. Another key aspect of Vipassana is observing the unsatisfactory or stressful nature of clinging to or identifying with fear. The practitioner notices how resistance to fear or identification with it as my fear creates additional suffering beyond the initial fear response itself. This insight gradually weakens the habitual tendency to either fight against fear or become completely identified with it. Perhaps most profound is the insight into the empty or not-self nature of fear. Through sustained investigation, practitioners come to recognize that fear, like all phenomena, lacks an independent, inherent existence. It arises dependently based on causes and conditions, perhaps triggered by a memory, reinforced by thought patterns, maintained by certain beliefs, and influenced by physical states like fatigue or hunger. This understanding of fear as a conditioned process rather than a solid entity creates tremendous freedom from its grip. The Buddha compared this insight practice to the way a skilled butcher dismembers a cow, separating it at the natural joints rather than hacking randomly at the whole. Similarly, insight meditation dismembers our solidified experience of fear, seeing the natural divisions between its components rather than struggling with fear as a monolithic enemy. This skillful dismantling through clear seeing naturally reduces fear's power over us. Practically speaking, Vipassana practice with fear might involve sitting in meditation and allowing fear to arise, or noticing it when it arises spontaneously, then systematically investigating its components with questions like, what sensations are present in the body right now? Where are they located? How do they change? What thoughts are arising? How does the mind create a story around these sensations? What happens when I don't resist these experiences but simply observe them clearly? This investigation doesn't require that we generate intense fear during formal practice. We can work with mild or moderate fear as it naturally arises, gradually developing the skills to maintain clear seeing even with stronger fear. The insights gained from working with milder fear transfer to more intense experiences, as the underlying patterns are similar regardless of intensity. For those dealing with intense anxiety or panic, insight practice might begin with briefer periods of investigation, perhaps supported by more stabilizing practices like breath awareness or compassion when the fear becomes overwhelming. With time and practice, the capacity to maintain clear seeing even during intense fear gradually develops, leading to profound shifts in how fear is experienced. Research on experienced insight meditators shows they process emotional stimuli differently than non-meditators, while they still recognize potentially threatening situations. Their responses show less emotional reactivity and faster recovery. Brain imaging studies reveal decreased activity in regions associated with fear processing and increased activity in areas related to executive function and attention regulation, suggesting a fundamental shift in how fear is processed. The insights that come through Vipassana practice aren't just intellectual understandings, but direct, experiential recognitions that transform our relationship with fear at a fundamental level. We don't just know intellectually that fear is impermanent and empty of solid existence. We see and feel this directly, which naturally changes how we relate to fear when it arises. Over time, consistent insight practice leads to what Buddhist psychology describes as fear without fearfulness, the capacity to recognize potential dangers appropriately without the additional suffering of anxiety, panic, or emotional reactivity. The basic fear response may still arise when warranted, but the mind no longer amplifies it through identification, resistance, or elaboration. This transformation doesn't typically happen all at once, but develops gradually through consistent practice. Each time we bring clear seeing to the experience of fear, we weaken old habitual patterns and strengthen the capacity for direct, unfiltered awareness. With time, this clarity becomes more accessible even during challenging moments, creating greater freedom in our relationship with fear. While Vipassana meditation helps us see the component parts of fear and their impermanent nature, Buddhist practice offers an even more profound level of insight that can fundamentally transform our relationship with fear. Understanding emptiness, sunyata. This teaching represents one of Buddhism's most revolutionary contributions to understanding the mind and reality itself, with powerful implications for working with fear and anxiety. Emptiness doesn't mean nothingness or non-existence, as the term might suggest in everyday English. Rather, it refers to the understanding that all phenomena, including fear itself, lack independent, inherent existence. Everything arises dependently, based on countless causes and conditions, without a solid, separate core or essence. The Buddha expressed this insight through the principle of dependent origination. Nothing exists on its own. Everything exists in dependence on other factors. When applied specifically to fear, this understanding reveals something remarkable. What we experience as seemingly solid, real fear actually has no independent existence of its own. Fear arises based on a complex interplay of physical sensations, mental images, conceptual thoughts, past conditioning, cultural programming, and countless other factors. When any of these conditions change, the fear itself changes because it has no separate existence apart from these conditions. This insight doesn't deny that fear appears in our experience. We definitely feel it, but it helps us see that fear doesn't exist in the way we typically imagine it does, as a solid, independent entity that has power over us. Just as a rainbow appears vividly in the sky, yet has no substantial existence apart from the interaction of light, moisture, and perception, fear appears vividly in our experience without having substantial, independent existence. Practically speaking, understanding emptiness transforms our relationship with fear by undermining its apparent solidity and inevitability. When we perceive fear as a solid thing happening to us, we feel helpless against its power. When we recognize its empty, dependent nature, we see numerous points where we can influence the conditions that give rise to fear, creating more space and freedom in relation to it. For instance, if you experience social anxiety, the emptiness perspective helps you recognize that this fear isn't a fixed part of your identity or an objective reality you must accept. Rather, it's a complex process arising from multiple conditions, perhaps memories of past embarrassment, beliefs about others' judgments, physical tension patterns, and habitual thought loops. Seeing the dependent, constructed nature of this fear weakens its apparent solidity and inevitability. One of the most practical applications of emptiness to fear involves examining the boundaries between self and other that underlie many fears. Much of our fear stems from the sense of being a separate self that needs protection from outside threats. Through investigating emptiness, we begin to recognize that these boundaries aren't as solid or definitive as they appear. The sharp division between me in here and threatening world out there begins to soften as we see the interdependent nature of all experience. This doesn't mean we lose appropriate boundaries or become unable to function in daily life. Rather, we develop a more flexible, less rigid sense of identity that isn't so vulnerable to threat. We still recognize conventional distinctions between self and other for practical purposes, but we're not completely identified with or limited by these distinctions, which creates greater psychological freedom in relation to fear. The Buddha offered various contemplative practices to help us directly experience emptiness rather than just understand it conceptually. One approach involves examining phenomena to see if we can find any permanent, independent essence within them. With fear, this might mean asking, where exactly is this fear located? Does it have a size, period, shape, dot, or color? If I look for the fear itself, apart from bodily sensations and thoughts about danger, can I actually find it? This examination typically reveals that we can't locate a solid thing called fear separate from the changing flow of sensations, thoughts, and reactions. This direct recognition of fear's empty nature doesn't make the experience disappear magically, but it does transform our relationship with it, revealing its constructed, dependent nature rather than perceiving it as an objective reality happening to us. Another practice involves contemplating how fear arises dependently, noticing the various conditions that come together to create the fear experience. We might observe how a particular sensory trigger, like a loud noise, leads to a startle response, which triggers memories of past danger, which activates certain beliefs, which generates mental images of threat, which intensifies physical arousal, creating a feedback loop we label as fear. Seeing this dependent arising clearly reveals fear's constructed nature. Emptiness practice doesn't happen in isolation from other Buddhist approaches to fear. In fact, it works most effectively in conjunction with practices like mindfulness, compassion, and ethical conduct. Mindfulness helps us stay present with our experience as we investigate its empty nature. Compassion prevents emptiness insights from becoming cold or dissociative. And ethical conduct provides the foundation of safety that allows us to explore fear's nature without being overwhelmed by it. For those new to emptiness practice, it can be helpful to begin with guided meditations or teachings that specifically address fear from this perspective. Many Buddhist teachers offer accessible instructions that help translate this profound philosophical insight into practical experience. With time and consistent practice, the understanding of emptiness moves from conceptual knowledge to direct insight that naturally transforms how we relate to fear. Research on long-term Buddhist practitioners suggests that this understanding creates measurable changes in how the brain processes fear. Studies show reduced activity in brain regions associated with self-referential processing during threatening situations, suggesting less activation of the self-protection networks that normally amplify fear responses. This aligns with practitioners' reports of experiencing fear differently, still recognizing potential dangers but without the additional suffering of a threatened sense of self. The Buddha cautioned against misunderstanding emptiness as nihilism, nothing exists, or as a purely intellectual concept rather than direct experience. He taught emptiness not as a philosophical position to defend, but as a raft for crossing the river of suffering, a practical tool for liberation rather than a theory to cling to. With fear, specifically, emptiness serves as a tool for loosening fear's grip rather than a position about reality. This understanding of emptiness naturally leads to greater psychological freedom because it reveals that what we took to be solid, fixed reality, including our fears, is actually more fluid, open, and workable than we realized. Rather than facing fear as an insurmountable obstacle or inherent aspect of who we are, we recognize it as a dependent process that can be worked with skillfully. This recognition doesn't eliminate appropriate caution in genuinely dangerous situations, but it does liberate us from unnecessary suffering created by our misperception of fear's nature. While the direct experience of emptiness represents a profound insight that can transform fear at its roots, Buddhist practice also offers more structured approaches for working with fearful and anxious thinking. This brings us to Dharma contemplation for anxiety, systematic ways of reflecting on Buddhist teachings to transform the cognitive patterns that generate and sustain fear. Dharma contemplation differs from passive reading or intellectual study of Buddhist concepts. It involves actively engaging with teachings through focused reflection, allowing them to penetrate below the surface level of the intellect and transform our understanding at a deeper level. The Buddha frequently recommended this kind of contemplative reflection, encouraging practitioners not just to hear the teachings but to consider them deeply and apply them to their direct experience. For those dealing with anxiety and fear, regular contemplation of specific teachings can gradually reshape mental habits that fuel distress. Unlike some modern approaches that focus primarily on challenging the content of thoughts, Dharma contemplation works at a more fundamental level, addressing the underlying views and assumptions that generate anxious thinking in the first place. The practice typically involves selecting a specific teaching relevant to fear, reflecting on it deeply, and considering how it applies to your actual experience. You might contemplate a traditional Buddhist teaching, a verse from a text, or a contemporary expression of the Dharma. The key is engaging with it actively and personally rather than treating it as abstract philosophy or someone else's wisdom. For example, someone struggling with persistent worry might contemplate the Buddha's teaching on the futility of excessive thinking. If by worrying you could prevent the future suffering you fear, then worry would make sense. But can worry actually accomplish this? This reflection isn't meant to dismiss legitimate planning or preparation, but to recognize when thinking has crossed into unproductive rumination that creates suffering without benefit. The contemplation process typically begins with reading or recalling the teaching, then reflecting on it from various angles. Is this true in my experience? How does this apply to specific situations where I feel fear? What would change if I fully integrated this understanding? This exploration happens not just intellectually, but with full emotional engagement, allowing the teaching to challenge habitual patterns of thinking and perceiving. What makes Dharma contemplation particularly effective for anxiety is that it directly addresses the views and beliefs that generate fearful thinking. Many anxiety disorders involve distorted core beliefs about the self, others, or the nature of reality itself. Buddhist teachings directly challenge many of these distortions, offering alternative perspectives that naturally reduce anxiety when deeply internalized. For instance, many anxious people hold the core belief that to be safe or worthy, they must have complete control over their lives and experiences. This belief creates constant anxiety because complete control is impossible in an interdependent world. Contemplating teachings on non-self and interdependence directly challenges this belief, offering the alternative view that well-being comes not from perfect control, but from wise relationship with whatever arises. Similarly, those with social anxiety often hold core beliefs about the necessity of others' approval and the catastrophic nature of potential rejection or judgment. Contemplating teachings on the nature of true happiness as coming from within rather than external validation gradually weakens these beliefs, reducing the fear that stems from them. The process of Dharma contemplation creates cognitive change not through argument or forced positive thinking, but through genuine insight that arises from deep reflection. When we truly see the limitations and suffering created by our current beliefs, and recognize the freedom offered by alternative perspectives, the mind naturally inclines toward the more liberating view. One effective approach involves contemplating teachings that directly counter your specific fear patterns. If you fear uncertainty, you might regularly contemplate teachings on the inherent uncertainty of life and how peace comes not from perfect certainty, but from becoming comfortable with not knowing. If you fear failure or inadequacy, you might contemplate teachings on Buddha nature or basic goodness, the inherent completeness that exists prior to achievement or external validation. The Buddha offered specific contemplations for different types of fear. For fear of physical harm or death, He recommended contemplating the inevitability of bodily change and the freedom that comes from not identifying completely with the body. For fear of loss, he suggested contemplating impermanence and the suffering that comes from clinging to what must eventually change. For fear of bad reputation, he advised contemplating the limited value of others' opinions compared to the peace of living with integrity. Contemporary Buddhist teachers have developed additional contemplations specifically for modern anxiety patterns. For health anxiety, contemplations on the body as a natural process rather than a possession to perfect or protect. For ecological or global fears, contemplations on appropriate care without the additional suffering of despair or panic. For technology-related anxieties, contemplations on finding balance between connection and boundaries. The effects of regular Dharma contemplation tend to be gradual but profound. Unlike techniques that provide immediate but temporary relief from anxiety, contemplative practice works at the level of underlying views and beliefs, creating more fundamental and lasting transformation. With consistent practice, the teachings move from intellectual concepts to embodied understanding that naturally influences how we perceive and respond to potentially frightening situations. Many practitioners find it helpful to maintain a contemplative journal, recording insights and questions that arise during reflection. This creates continuity between practice sessions and helps track subtle changes in perspective that might otherwise go unnoticed. It also provides a reference during particularly anxious periods, offering reminders of insights that may be temporarily obscured by fear. Dharma contemplation works most effectively when integrated with other practices like meditation, ethical conduct, and community support. Meditation creates the mental stability and clarity necessary for effective contemplation. Ethical conduct provides a foundation of safety and integrity, and community offers guidance and perspective that prevents contemplation from becoming distorted by individual blind spots or misunderstandings. What many discover through consistent Dharma contemplation is that anxiety stems largely from how we interpret and relate to our experience rather than from the experience itself. By transforming these interpretations at their root through deep reflection on alternative perspectives, we naturally create conditions for greater peace and freedom in relation to fear. This approach doesn't deny the reality of legitimate dangers or the appropriateness of certain fears. Rather, it helps distinguish between fears that serve a protective function and those that merely create additional suffering through misperception. When we see more clearly, we can respond more wisely to life's genuine challenges while releasing the unnecessary suffering of anxiety based on distorted views. Through the combination of all these Buddhist approaches, from mindfulness and compassion to understanding emptiness and contemplating the Dharma, we develop a comprehensive toolkit for working with fear. No single practice represents the complete solution, but together they address fear at every level: physically, emotionally, cognitively, and at the most fundamental level of how we understand ourselves and reality. This integrated approach doesn't promise a life without fear, but rather the wisdom to relate to fear in ways that lead to greater freedom, peace, and well-being even when fear arises.